The silence in the fourth-floor corridor of the Grand Plaza Hotel was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and tasted of stale floor wax, century-old dust, and impending ruin. The 3D digital schematics glowed with a harsh, clinical blue light on the screen of my heavy tablet, casting long, warped shadows across the faded floral wallpaper. It was exactly 9:30 on a freezing Friday night in late October. Outside, the brutal wind coming off the Charles River howled against the reinforced glass windows at the far end of the hall, rattling the antique brass latches with a relentless, mechanical rhythm. I pressed my laser measure against the cold plaster wall, my knuckles white and aching from 8 unbroken hours of gripping the device. The faint, high-pitched beep confirmed the dimension, logging another data point into the massive proprietary file that was supposed to save my life, or, at the very least, save my bank account from total collapse. Financial desperation was a relentless tide, and I was drowning one grueling night shift at a time. My firm ID badge swung against my collarbone, the hard plastic edge biting into my skin. Clara Vance-led architectural draftsman. The title sounded prestigious, but the reality was nothing more than a high-functioning survival mechanism. The medical bills from my mother's final 6 months in hospice were a vicious, living entity, multiplying in my mailbox with terrifying speed. The premium overtime pay for completing these digital models ahead of schedule was the only barrier standing between me and absolute ruin. The hotel itself was a labyrinth of historic secrets, a towering monument to Boston's Gilded Age elite, nestled deep in the prestigious heart of Beacon Hill. My firm had been contracted to execute a comprehensive structural survey before the upcoming modernization project, and the burden of absolute accuracy fell entirely on my shoulders. I traced the line of the intricate crown molding with my bare fingertips, feeling the slight unevenness beneath the layers of fresh cream paint. The craftsmanship was impeccable, dating back to 1922, a time when walls were built to withstand artillery rather than just partition a space. But the architectural beauty was entirely lost on my exhausted body. My shoulders burned with a dull, throbbing ache that radiated down to my lower back, settling onto my spine like a heavy, suffocating weight. I rolled my neck, listening to the sharp crack of my vertebrae, echoing in the empty hallway. I shouldn't have been here this late. The primary construction crews had clocked out at 5 in the afternoon, leaving the sprawling, half-empty wings of the building to the night security staff and the ghosts of wealthy patrons long gone. I adjusted the collar of my worn olive-green blouse, shivering violently as a draft of freezing air seeped through the porous floorboards. The heating system had been partially shut down for the renovation, leaving the upper floors feeling like a refrigerated vault. My breath plumed in the dim amber glow of the emergency lights. I pulled up at the master layer of the layout on my tablet, zooming in on the intricate web of load-bearing structures that supported the West Wing. Architectural surveying wasn't just about drawing lines on a screen. It was a forensic science. It required stripping away the cosmetic illusions of a building to understand its skeletal truth. I cross-referenced the laser measurements with the original ink and vellum plans, my eyes straining against the glare of the glass display. The digital schematics required absolute precision. If I miscalculated the depth of a structural column by even half an inch, the upcoming $1 million HVAC installation would fail catastrophically. The pressure was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making every breath feel shallow and insufficient. I knelt on the freezing marble floor, ignoring the sharp pain shooting through my kneecaps, to measure the baseboard alignment. The cold seeped through my thin slacks, numbing my skin. I rubbed my hands together, trying to generate some friction, some small spark of warmth, but my fingers remained stiff and clumsy. At 28, I had perfected the art of being invisible. It was a survival mechanism forged in the fires of a turbulent childhood and owned through years of navigating male-dominated construction sites where a young woman with a tablet was often dismissed. I didn't demand respect with loud arguments. I demanded it through undeniable, bulletproof competence. I knew the exact tensile strength of the steel beams hiding behind the decorative plaster. I knew the fire rating of the acoustic tiles above my head. I understood the silent language of this hotel better than the men who owned it. I moved down the corridor, the rubber wheels of my equipment cart squeaking faintly against the polished floorboards. I paused in front of a massive double-wide alcove. According to my files, this space should have housed a standard linen closet. Instead, it was an expanse of blank, unyielding wall. I frowned, raising my laser measure again. The red dot hit the plaster. The numbers flashed on the tiny screen. I recalculated the square footage in my head, my analytical mind automatically searching for the missing variable in the architectural equation. There was a void behind this wall, a blind spot in the hotel's otherwise meticulous records. I made a detailed note on my tablet, my stylus flying across the screen in rapid, precise strokes. The building was lying to me. I took a slow, deep breath, the cold air burning the back of my throat. The scent of ozone and impending rain filtered in through a poorly sealed window joint, carrying the bitter chill of the autumn night. It was just a building, just a job. I adjusted my grip on the tablet, immersed in the mathematical puzzle of the hidden space. I was so completely focused on the structural anomaly that I entirely missed the first warning sign. I didn't hear the security cameras at the end of the hall power down with a faint, synchronized click. I didn't notice the sudden absolute cessation of the distant generator hum. I was standing in the middle of a gilded cage. I was completely unaware that the lock was about to be broken. The disruption began not with a shout, but with a violent mechanical crunch. The sound tore through the silence of the corridor, vibrating through the limestone floorboards and traveling straight up my spine. It was the distinct, unmistakable noise of the heavy-duty service elevator doors being forced open with industrial pry bars. I froze, my thumb hovering inches above the screen of my tablet. The building's service elevators were locked down at this hour, requiring a biometric scan and a high-level keycard to operate. The screech of tearing metal echoed down the hallway, followed immediately by the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots hitting the marble foyer. Not security. The hotel's night watchmen wore soft-soled shoes and moved with the lazy, shuffling gait of men bored out of their minds. These footsteps were aggressive, synchronized, and moving with terrifying, tactical purpose. I backed into the deep shadow of the architectural alcove, my breath suddenly trapped in my lungs. My heart, which had been beating with the slow, steady rhythm of exhaustion, abruptly spiked into a frantic, hammering sprint against my ribs. I clutched the heavy tablet to my chest, my knuckles turning bone white as I peered around the edge of the plaster molding. The amber emergency lights flickered, casting long, nightmarish silhouettes against the century-old wallpaper. 5 men poured out of the service stairwell down the opposite side of the hall. They were massive, dressed in dark tactical gear that absorbed the meager light, their faces obscured by the shadows. But it wasn't their size that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. It was the dull, metallic gleam of suppressed automatic weapons resting casually in their hands. At the center of the formation stood a man who radiated a specific, localized kind of terror. He didn't carry a rifle, he didn't need to. Viktor Belikov moved with the arrogant, heavy-footed swagger of a predator who owned the killing floor. I didn't know his name at that exact second, but the criminal underworld of Boston whispered his alias in terrified reverence. Belikov was a ruthless enforcer for a rival syndicate, a man who relied on sheer, unadulterated violence and intimidation. He wore a dark leather coat that swept around his calves like a storm cloud, his rigid posture screaming of brutal intent. He gestured sharply with a gloved hand, and his men instantly fanned out, moving down the corridor with absolute efficiency. They began kicking open the doors of the unfinished guest rooms, the solid oak frames splintering and cracking under the brutal force. They were hunting someone, and they were destroying everything in their path to find them. A scream tore through the silence. It was a high, panicked sound from a lower floor that was abruptly cut short by the muffled, coughing spit of a suppressed gunshot. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave of ice water. This was more than a robbery. This was a systematic execution. The armed men were moving closer, the beams of their tactical flashlights sweeping across the walls, cutting through the gloom like physical blades. If the light caught the reflective surface of my tablet, if they heard the panicked, shallow gasps of air I was fighting to control, I was dead. There would be no negotiation, no frantic explanations about Clara Vance, the simple architectural draftsman working late to pay off her dead mother's debts. Men who brought military-grade rifles into a historic hotel did not leave witnesses. I needed to move now. I squeezed my eyes shut for a microsecond, forcing my terrified, fragmented mind to access the digital schematics I had memorized over the past 3 weeks. My brain processed the spatial data with desperate speed. The 4th floor was a long, U-shaped corridor with only 2 main exit points, the central grand staircase and the eastern service elevator. Both were currently blocked by Belikov's kill squad. The fire escapes on the exterior walls were structurally compromised and wired with old, highly sensitive alarms, a detail I had personally highlighted in red on my report just yesterday. If I touched those emergency doors, the sirens would scream through the empty hotel, pinpointing my exact location. I was completely boxed in. Panic, raw and acidic, burned the back of my throat, tasting like copper and bile. I couldn't run down the main hall. I couldn't fight. My only option was absolute concealment. I opened my eyes, scanning the darkness. 30 feet down the opposite end of the hall, near the blind corner where the U-shape bent back toward the west wing, there was a door. It was far more than an ordinary door. In my digital schematics, the space beyond that frame was listed as a structural void, an error in the original blueprints. But I had measured the corridor. I knew the spatial mathematics. There was a room there, unmarked, unlisted, and heavily reinforced. Room 404. It was the only door in this entire wing that didn't have a temporary construction lock. Check the alcoves. Tear down the drywall if you have to. Viktor Belikov barked the command, his voice thick with a guttural Eastern European accent, the sound echoing off the plaster walls like a physical blow. The flashlight beams swept closer, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. They were 30 yards away, then 25. I didn't think. I just moved. I slipped out of my flats, leaving the sensible black shoes hidden behind the equipment cart, and bolted silently down the corridor in my stocking feet. The cold marble sent a shockwave of freezing pain up my legs, but adrenaline had already hijacked my nervous system, turning the terror into a desperate, hyper-focused clarity. I stayed low, pressing my shoulder against the wall, sliding through the darkness like a ghost. Behind me, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass escalated. They were checking the room right next to the alcove I had just abandoned. 20 feet, 10 feet. The formidable timber entrance of room 404 loomed ahead of me, solid and imposing. It was a masterpiece of architectural security, vastly different from the standard hollow-core oak doors of the other suites undergoing renovation. The wood was dark, polished to a dull sheen that seemed to absorb the meager emergency lighting, and the frame was subtly reinforced with industrial steel casing, painted to match the historic trim. Whoever had commissioned this VIP suite had retrofitted it to withstand a siege. It was a door designed to keep the violent, chaotic world outside from ever breaching the sanctuary within. I prayed, with a desperate, frantic intensity, that it wasn't locked. If the brass handle didn't turn, I would be trapped against the wood, completely exposed to the approaching flashlight beams. I reached the entrance, my chest heaving, my lungs screaming for oxygen. The footsteps behind me grew louder, the heavy boots stomping down the hallway, the beam of a flashlight swinging wildly in my direction. I grabbed the cold brass handle. My trembling fingers slipped on the smooth metal. I readjusted my grip, pressing my weight against the mechanism, and pushed. The handle gave way with a smooth, oiled click. The mechanism was unlocked. I threw my weight against the heavy wood, slipping through the narrow opening. My freezing fingers scrambled for the edge of the thick wooden frame to pull it shut. But the sheer weight of the timber resisted my exhausted muscles. The flashlight beam swept toward the gap in the hallway, the brilliant white light slicing toward my face. Before the piercing light could touch me, a large, warm hand reached out from the absolute darkness of the VIP suite. Long, powerful fingers wrapped over mine, gripping the edge of the solid wood. The contrast between my freezing, trembling hands and the immaculate, scorching heat of his skin sent a jolt of electricity straight up my arm. He pulled the door shut with effortless, terrifying strength, extinguishing the hallway light in a fraction of a second. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut. The sound was as sharp as a gunshot in the silent room. The deadbolt slid into place with a heavy, mechanized thud that spoke of custom engineering and absolute finality. I pressed my back against the cool wood, my breath hitching in my throat as the aggressive footsteps outside slowed, pausing right outside the frame. The men were inches away, separated from me only by a few inches of steel-reinforced timber. I was entirely trapped in the pitch-black room with a stranger, but as the scent of expensive bergamot and dark, aged whiskey washed over me, my panicked heartbeat strangely began to slow. I didn't know it yet, but I had just locked myself in with Dominic Rossini, the sovereign leader of the city's most powerful syndicate. "You're in the wrong room, Clara Vance." Dominic's low, smooth voice cut through the shadows, vibrating with absolute command and a terrifying, protective calm. but you're exactly where you need to be." At exactly 9:36, his words hung in the suffocating darkness, carrying a weight that forced the oxygen straight out of my lungs. My name. He knew my name. The realization hit me like a physical blow, sending a fresh wave of adrenaline crashing through my exhausted, trembling nervous system. I stood frozen, my spine pressed rigidly against the wall beside the entrance, my bare feet sinking into thick woolen carpets, so deep they swallowed the sound of my ragged breathing. The sensory contrast was dizzying. Seconds ago, I had been running for my life across freezing, unforgiving marble, hunted by men with suppressed automatic weapons. Now, I was trapped in an invisible sanctuary, with a man whose reputation was built on a different, far more sophisticated kind of violence. Slowly, as my pupils dilated to adjust to the gloom, the visual details of room 404 began to emerge from the shadows. The moonlight filtered through massive, floor-to-soiling windows, lining the rear boundary of the suite, casting long, silver geometric patterns across the floor. My analytical mind, desperate for a stabilizing anchor, immediately began to deconstruct the space. This was more than a mere hidden room. It was an architectural masterpiece of clandestine luxury, entirely scrubbed from the digital schematics I carried. The walls featured polished timber paneling, seamlessly integrating high-grade acoustic dampening materials, perforated foam hidden behind decorative slatting that absorbed the chaotic echoes of the outside world. I could see the subtle thickness of the window frames. It was bulletproof, reinforced glass, likely rated to stop a high-caliber sniper round from a mile away. And then, there was the center of the room. A private dining area sat bathed in the pale moonlight, featuring a solid marble table draped in immaculate linen. A crystal decanter of amber liquid sat atop it, but beside it, a knocked-over crystal glass lay abandoned, a minor casualty of his sudden rush to the door to pull me inside. I stared at the spilled wine spreading across the white tablecloth, like blood seeping through gauze. My exhausted struggling to reconcile the violent threat outside with the absolute opulence inside. The sheer elegance of that pristine fabric felt like a mocking contrast to my own disheveled reality. My olive green blouse was wrinkled and clinging to my cold sweat. My slacks were dusted with century-old plaster, and my toes were bruised and numb. I was a fractured, drowning woman trespassing in a world of absolute, untouchable power. From the periphery of the moonlight, the man in the shadows finally moved. Dominic Rossini stepped fully into the silver illumination, and the remaining breath in my throat vanished entirely. He was taller than the underworld rumors suggested, possessing a broad-shouldered, imposing physique that seemed to command the very air in the room. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped flawlessly over his frame, the heavy fabric speaking of elite tailors and zero compromises. But it wasn't the clothing that made my pulse hammer against my ribs. It was his overwhelming presence. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a sovereign who had never known what it meant to yield. "How do you know my name?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a hoarse rasp. I hated how fragile I sounded. I clutched the heavy tablet to my chest, using it as a pathetic, modern-day shield against a man who could likely dismantle my entire life with a single phone call. He took a slow, deliberate step closer, the scent of expensive bergamot and aged whiskey wrapping around me, like a familiar, heavy blanket. His storm-gray eyes studied my trembling hands with absolute command, taking in the white knuckle grip I had on the device, before slowly dragging back up to my face. They were not the manic, aggressive eyes of the thugs tearing apart the hallway outside. They were cold, calculating, and terrifyingly calm. He didn't look at me like I was an intruder. He looked at me like I was a highly complex puzzle he had already solved. "You have a habit of working past midnight." "Miss Vance," he replied, his tone low and remarkably smooth, devoid of any immediate threat. "My security detail has logged your late-night surveying sessions for the past 3 weeks. A dedicated architectural draftsman, trying to map a building that prefers to keep its secrets." My mind raced, connecting the fragmented pieces of information. This historic landmark was undergoing a massive modernization, funded by a web of corporate shell companies. My firm had been hired by a faceless holding group. But standing here, looking at the sovereign leader of the city's most powerful syndicate, the truth crystallized. This hotel was not merely a historic landmark. It was his territory. I hadn't just stumbled into a random VIP suite. I had breached his private fortress. "They're going to search every room," I managed to say, forcing my professional competence to override the primal terror vibrating in my bones. Viktor Belikov, that's who is out there. He ordered his men to tear down the drywall to check the alcoves. Belikov is a blunt instrument, Dominic stated, his expression remaining entirely unreadable. He casually adjusted the cuff of his immaculate jacket, as if we were discussing a minor weather inconvenience rather than an armed death squad. He relies on volume and intimidation because he lacks strategy. He does not know this suite exists. They have axes, I pushed back, my architectural anxiety flaring as I remembered the splintering oak outside. They have industrial pry bars. If they find this door, let them try to find it, he interrupted softly. I looked at him, truly looked at him. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet, absolute certainty. The irony of my situation was staggering. I had spent my entire adult life building impenetrable walls, projecting an image of bulletproof competence to protect myself from the chaotic, crushing realities of medical debt and corporate dismissal. I had perfected the survival tactic of staying utterly unnoticed. Yet here I was, stripped of all my defenses, shivering in the dark, entirely dependent on the goodwill of a man who operated outside every law I had ever known. I should have left at 5, I murmured, more to myself than to him. The exhaustion I had been fighting off for 8 unbroken hours suddenly crashed over me. A tidal wave of fatigue that made my knees buckle slightly. I should have just logged the baseline measurements and gone home to my empty apartment. But I needed the overtime. Dominic's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He reached out, his movements deliberately slow, telegraphing his intentions so I wouldn't flinch. His large, warm hand hovered just inches from my cold cheek, not quite touching, but close enough that I could feel the magnetic pull of his body heat. Survival is a relentless taskmaster, he said quietly, his voice carrying a depth of understanding I hadn't expected from a ruthless syndicate boss. But tonight, your overtime is canceled. You are under my jurisdiction now. The sheer authority in his statement sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the freezing draft of the building. He wasn't asking for my permission. He was stating a geopolitical fact within the borders of this room. The fragile, intimate silence was suddenly shattered by a violent concussive boom that vibrated through the floorboards. My breath hitched violently. They had reached our section of the corridor. The muffled, heavy impact of a steel pry bar slamming against a neighboring doorframe echoed through the acoustic dampening of the suite. It sounded like a bomb going off underwater. "They're here," I choked out, my knuckles turning bone-white as I gripped my tablet. The primal acidic taste of panic flooded the back of my throat. I instinctively took a step toward the center of the room, my survival instincts screaming at me to run, to hide, to find a secondary exit. Before I could move another inch, Dominic moved. He didn't rush. He didn't scramble. He closed the distance between us with a terrifying, fluid speed, instantly positioning his broad, imposing body firmly between me and the entrance. As the armed pursuers began to violently bang on the outer suite door, Dominic physically shut out the danger, becoming an impenetrable human shield. "Stay exactly where you are," he commanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper that brokered zero argument. He turned his back to me, facing the reinforced portal. Even though the primary deadbolt was already engaged, Dominic reached down to the baseboard. With a swift, practiced motion, he flipped a hidden steel panel and engaged a secondary floor-level mechanical lock. The heavy, metallic clank of the titanium rod, sliding into the reinforced floor joist, was a beautiful, industrial symphony to my architectural ears. He then reached up to the hinge side, locking a third biometric clasp that secured the timber into the very steel framework of the building. The pounding outside escalated into a frantic, aggressive rhythm. "This section is blank," a muffled voice yelled through the timber. It was one of Belikov's men. "There's no door on the layout, but the molding stops here. And break it down." The enforcer's guttural roar filtered through the thick wood, muffled but unmistakably furious. "If there's a cavity, clear it." The first strike of an industrial axe hit the solid wooden barrier. The sound was a dull, heavy thud that barely caused the wood to vibrate. In a standard hotel, that swing would have splintered the hollow core oak, sending jagged shrapnel flying into the room. Here it sounded like a fist hitting a solid brick wall. It held. I flinched, my heart performing a frantic, agonizing sprint against my ribs. I knew the exact tensile strength of commercial materials. I stared at the back of Dominic's bespoke suit, my analytical mind automatically crunching the structural variables. This wasn't just wood. It was a composite structure. I had seen the subtle steel casing when I ran inside. I knew it was filled with high-density ballistic resin designed to absorb kinetic impact. A second strike hit the wood. Then a third. Dominic didn't flinch. He stood firmly planted in front of the entrance, his hands resting casually at his sides, exuding a chilling, absolute calm. He didn't draw a weapon, he didn't shout back. He simply watched the door with the dark, patient eyes of a predator, observing prey trap itself in a cage. The sheer psychological dominance of his posture was mesmerizing. He was projecting an aura of extreme safety, an unshakable fortress of a man who trusted his own preparations implicitly. "The hinges are concealed," I whispered, unable to stop the technical assessment from spilling out of my mouth. My voice was shaky, but the data was rock solid. "The strike plate is continuous. They can't pry it open. They'd need a thermal lance or a breaching charge to compromise the frame." Dominic turned his head slightly, peering over his shoulder to look at me. The corner of his mouth twitched in the faintest shadow of a smirk. "I know, Clara, I designed it." A fourth strike hit the timber, followed immediately by the sound of metal vibrating painfully, as if the axe had simply bounced off the hidden steel core. "Fuck," the thug outside cursed loudly. "It's reinforced, solid steel underneath the veneer. Leave it." Belikov barked impatiently, the frustration bleeding through his muffled accent. "If it's a reinforced vault, the target didn't run in there in 3 seconds. Move down to the west stairwell. Check the linen closets." The heavy, synchronized thud of combat boots slowly began to recede, moving further down the U-shaped corridor. The immediate threat was walking away, thwarted by the architectural superiority of the room and the calculated foresight of the man standing in front of me. I let out a long, ragged exhale, my knees finally buckling under the massive adrenaline dump. I sank down onto the thick woolen rug, my back sliding against the polished timber paneling, completely drained. The tablet slipped from my rigid grip, landing on the carpet with a soft thud. I had survived. By sheer dumb luck and by the grace of a criminal sovereign, I was still breathing. Dominic remained by the door. For another full minute, his head tilted slightly, listening to the ambient vibrations of the building, with trained, hyper-aware senses. Only when the absolute silence of the 4th floor returned did he finally step away from the entrance. He walked over to where I was sitting on the floor. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me everything was fine. He knew better, and he knew I was too smart for comforting lies. Instead, he crouched down, his striking gaze meeting mine on my level. "They are moving to the west stairwell," he said quietly, his tone shifting from stoic commander to something closer to protective warmth. "Which means they will eventually secure the lobby. We cannot stay here indefinitely." I looked at his immaculate suit, then down at my bruised, dirt-streaked feet. The extreme contrast between us was a glaring reminder of the massive class disparity separating our worlds. He was power incarnate. I was a financially drowning draftsman who just wanted to pay off her medical debts. Yet as he reached out and gently picked up my heavy tablet from the floor, handing it back to me with a look of genuine professional respect, the boundary lines began to blur. "You said you were mapping the hidden structural voids," Dominic prompted, his eyes locking onto mine with intense focus. "Show me your digital schematics. If Belikov holds the main exits, we need a ghost route." I stared at him, my heart performing a strange, fluttering rhythm that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. He wasn't treating me like a helpless victim to be carried away. He was asking for my expertise. He was recognizing the hyper-competent survivor beneath the exhaustion and the panic. I took a shaky breath, my fingers curling around the cold metal of my tablet. The screen flared to life, casting that harsh clinical blue light across the dark luxury of the VIP suite. I was terrified, yes, but as I pulled up the master layer of the layout, a new resilient spark ignited in my chest. I was no longer merely hiding. I was going to help the most dangerous man in the city rewrite the map of our survival. The harsh clinical blue light from the tablet illuminated the space between us, casting sharp, imposing angles across Dominic's face. The silence in the VIP room deepened, settling around us like a heavy velvet drape, as the immediate noise outside finally faded completely into the cavernous expanse of the hotel. The aggressive, synchronized thud of combat boots was gone, replaced only by the relentless howling of the autumn wind, rattling the bulletproof glass across the expansive depth of the suite. We were isolated, completely cut off from the violent reality tearing through the 4th floor corridor, sealed inside a gilded cage of Dominic's own meticulous making. I swallowed dryly, my throat feeling like sandpaper scraping against my own pulse. The massive spike of adrenaline that had propelled me blindly down the freezing hallway was beginning to evaporate, leaving behind a cold, crushing wave of physical exhaustion. My fingers, gripping the rubberized edges of the tablet, were shaking. It went beyond a simple, nervous tremor. It was a violent, uncontrollable shivering that made the digital schematics on the screen jitter and blur. I hated it. I hated the physical manifestation of my fear, the undeniable biological proof of my vulnerability, in front of a man who looked like he had never been afraid of a single thing in his entire life. Dominic didn't speak immediately. He remained perfectly still, his tall, imposing frame blocking the ambient moonlight filtering in from the windows. His storm-gray eyes lowered, studying my trembling hands with absolute command. He wasn't looking at me with pity. Pity was a useless emotion reserved for the weak, and the sovereign leader of a syndicate didn't deal in weakness. He was analyzing me. He was watching the way my dust-covered, bruised fingers navigated the complex interface of the architectural software, despite the violent tremors. He watched with silent intensity as I bypassed the commercial layout layers, swiping past the cosmetic floor plans to access the raw, encrypted structural data I had personally coded over the past 3 weeks of grueling night shifts. I could almost hear the tactical calculations clicking behind his cold, predatory gaze. When I had first stumbled through that specific VIP threshold, I was nothing more than an unpredictable variable to him. A terrified civilian who had accidentally breached his ultimate sanctuary. He had known my name from his security logs, yes. He knew I was the lead draftsman contracted for the modernization project. But knowing a job title on a piece of paper and witnessing the actual, high-stakes execution of that work were two entirely different realities. As I pulled up the intricate 3D wireframes of the load-bearing columns, exposing the hidden skeletal truth of the massive building, the atmosphere in the room subtly shifted. I had ceased to be a simple low-level corporate employee, punching a clock to pay off medical debts. I was a professional surveyor holding the literal digital keys to the building's structural integrity. I wasn't a hostile spy, and I wasn't a liability. I was a tactical asset. "You're shivering," he observed, his low, gravelly voice breaking the heavy silence. It wasn't a question. It was a clinical statement of physiological fact, delivered with a calm that bordered on hypnotic. "It's just the adrenaline," I managed to say, forcing my voice to remain steady even as my teeth chattered against my will. I kept my eyes locked on the glowing screen, refusing to look up and let him see the raw panic still lingering in my dilated pupils, and the ambient temperature of the corridor. "The primary HVAC system is down for the renovation. It's freezing out there, and yet your precision remains entirely intact," Dominic noted quietly. He took a slow half-step closer, the subtle scent of expensive bergamot and dark, aged whiskey washing over me again. It was a grounding scent, rich and impossibly steady, cutting through the sterile smell of my own fear. Most people, when faced with the reality of Viktor Belikov's men, lose the ability to string a coherent thought together. They panic. They freeze. They make fatal, impulsive errors. You ran straight toward the only blind spot on the entire floor. "I didn't have a choice," I replied, my analytical mind automatically defending my actions, seeking refuge in the logic of my profession. The Eastern Service elevator was compromised the moment they breached the floor. The central grand staircase was a fatal choke point with zero cover. The fire escapes are wired with outdated, highly sensitive analog alarms that would have triggered a localized lockdown the second I touched the panic bar. I ran the spatial mathematics in my head. Room 404 was the only statistical anomaly in the blueprints that offered a zero-visibility refuge. Dominic slowly turned his head, looking back at the entrance we had just secured. The thick entryway stood resolute in the shadows, an impenetrable barrier between us and the heavily armed death squad roaming the hotel. You understood the structural integrity of this specific frame. You knew it wasn't a standard hollow core installation. I noticed the continuous strike plate and the concealed hinges when I approached the alcove, I explained, the familiar architectural terminology acting as a psychological anchor. Talking about structural engineering was safe. It was a world governed by predictable physics and undeniable math, a sharp, comforting contrast to the chaotic violence of the underworld. A standard historic hotel door is designed for privacy, not defense. This frame is reinforced with industrial steel casing. The sheer density of the wood suggests a ballistic resin core designed to absorb kinetic impact. The heavy timber isn't just a physical partition. It's a load-bearing element retrofitted directly into the primary limestone foundation of the building. Even if Belikov's men had realized this was a concealed room, their industrial axes would have only chipped the veneer. To actually breach that door, they would need a specialized thermal lance or a localized breaching charge to melt the titanium deadbolts. Dominic turned back to face me, the faint, dangerous shadow of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The sheer, terrifying weight of his attention was entirely focused on me, making my skin prickle with sudden heat. You deduced all of that complex engineering while running for your life in the dark on bare feet. Architecture doesn't lie, I whispered, finally tearing my eyes away from the digital screen to meet his gaze. The intensity in his piercing stare was paralyzing, anchoring me to the carpet. People lie. Corporate holding companies lie. But the structural load of a building always tells the truth. If you know how to read the bones, you know exactly where the armor is. And right now, Miss Vance, Dominic murmured, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with absolute, unshakable authority. You are the only person in this hotel who can read the bones well enough to get us out. The validation hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. For years, I had fought tooth and nail in a ruthless, male-dominated construction industry, constantly forced to prove my competence, constantly dismissed by arrogant project managers who saw nothing but a young woman holding a tablet. My expertise was always questioned, my calculations double-checked with condescending sighs. Yet here, in the absolute epicenter of a criminal crisis, the city's most lethal sovereign was looking at me with pure, unadulterated professional respect. He wasn't patronizing me. He wasn't trying to soothe my hysteria with empty, comforting promises. He was acknowledging my intellect as our primary weapon of survival. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, and forced my trembling fingers to stop. The shivering didn't magically disappear, but the core of my panic began to solidify into a hard, resilient determination. I tapped the screen, pulling up the subterranean layers of the sprawling estate, the wireframes glowing like a neon map of secrets. If Belikov is a blunt instrument, as you said, I began, my tone naturally shifting into the crisp, authoritative register I used during high-level engineering briefings. He will secure the perimeter first. He'll place his heavily armed men at the primary exits, the main lobby, the loading docks, and the underground parking garage. He wants to create a sealed box and then systematically crush whatever is trapped inside it. Standard syndicate siege tactics, Dominic agreed effortlessly, moving to stand right beside me. The heat radiating from his large, bespoke-clad body was a stark, overwhelming contrast to the freezing chill still clinging to my cheap olive-green blouse. He will lock down the elevators and choke the stairwells. He expects his target to panic and run toward the light. Then we don't go toward the light, I said, my stylus hovering decisively over the digital map. We go into the blind spots. I gestured toward the center of the VIP suite. I need a flat surface to expand the holographic projection of the blueprints. The screen is too small to trace a continuous route through the sub-basements. Dominic nodded once, a sharp, economic movement. He gestured gracefully toward the private dining area, bathed in the silver moonlight. I walked over on bruised, dirt-streaked bare feet, the thick luxury carpet muffling my steps completely. I placed the heavy tablet onto the solid marble table, right next to the crystal decanter of amber liquid. The ambient glow of the screen illuminated the immediate surroundings, highlighting the sheer, devastating opulence of the space. As I leaned over the table, my eyes caught a detail that made my breath hitch all over again. I stared at the wine spreading across the white tablecloth, like blood seeping through gauze. The dark crimson liquid from the knocked-over crystal glass had pooled and was slowly creeping across the pristine linen, staining the immaculate fabric with a violent, irrevocable mark. It was a visceral, haunting metaphor for the reality I was currently trapped in. The brutal, bleeding violence of the underworld was seeping into my carefully ordered, structurally sound life, and there was no way to wash the stain away. I was standing shoulder to shoulder with a sovereign cartel leader, plotting an escape through a building I had been hired to protect. The boundaries between my civilian world and his criminal empire were blurring, bleeding into one another, until I couldn't tell where my corporate identity ended, and my pure survival instincts began. Dominic stepped up right beside me. He was so close that the pristine wool sleeve of his charcoal suit brushed against my bare arm. A sudden, sharp spark of electric warmth shot through my skin, a startling, involuntary reaction that contrasted violently with the cold dread sitting heavy in my stomach. The slow-burn tension between us was palpable, a thick, heavy energy that crackled in the narrow space separating our bodies. It was an unspoken, highly charged dynamic. I was terrified of his world, yes, but I was also acutely aware of the overwhelming, absolute safety his presence projected. Every micro-shift of his weight, every quiet, controlled intake of his breath, communicated an absolute, sovereign command over the environment. He was an apex predator, but in this specific moment, he was my ultimate protector. "Focus, Clara," Dominic murmured, his voice a low, intimate rumble that vibrated deep in his chest. He wasn't reprimanding me for staring at the spilled wine. He was anchoring me back to the present, demanding my intellect. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers resting lightly on the edge of the cold marble table, just inches from my own tense hand. "Where is the flaw in Belikov's siege?" I forced my gaze away from the expanding crimson stain, blinking rapidly to clear the exhaustion from my vision. I zoomed in on the architectural layers, stripping away the modern cosmetic additions to reveal the hotel's original 1922 foundation. The intricate web of lines shifted on the display, telling a story almost a century old. Grand Plaza functioned as more than a historic hotel, I explained, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The profound intimacy of our proximity made speaking loudly feel like a violation of the quiet sanctuary we had formed. The elite patrons of the Gilded Age didn't just want extreme luxury. They demanded absolute discretion. When the holding company hired my firm, they provided the sanitized, legally approved city records. But my ground-penetrating radar scans from last week revealed a series of undocumented structural anomalies hidden deep in the western wing. Dominic leaned in closer, his focused irises tracking the rapid, precise movements of my stylus across the glowing screen. His proximity was intoxicating, a dangerous mix of immense physical power and refined, aristocratic grace that commanded complete submission. A smuggler's route, exactly. I nodded, my heart beating a rapid staccato against my ribs as the adrenaline surged back, this time fueled by intellectual triumph rather than blind panic. There is a forgotten service corridor that runs completely parallel to the main western stairwell. It was originally designed to transport illicit liquor from the sub-basement directly to the private speakeasy, hidden on the second floor. During the massive 1980s corporate renovation, the corridor was officially sealed off and repurposed on the blueprints as an industrial ventilation shaft. If it was sealed off, how do we access it without heavy demolition tools? Dominic asked, his analytical mind keeping perfect pace with my technical architectural breakdown. They sealed the primary access doors with cinder blocks and plaster, I said, pulling up a precise cross-section of the interior wall. But they were lazy. They didn't alter the core structural framework to save on the construction budget. The old industrial dumbwaiter shaft that serviced the speakeasy was simply walled over with cheap drywall. It connects the fourth-floor linen closet directly down to the sub-basement, bypassing the main lobby, the central elevators, and Belikov's security checkpoints entirely. Dominic stared at the digital schematics, his strong jaw clenching as he silently calculated the tactical viability of the ghost route. The silence stretched between us again, thick, heavy, and pregnant with unspoken risk. I watched the subtle flex of the muscles in his jaw, the harsh angle of his cheekbones illuminated by the harsh blue light of my tablet. He was a man who lived his entire life anticipating betrayal, a sovereign ruler constantly calculating the deadly geometry of violence. Yet, he was standing here in the dark, trusting his life and his empire to a civilian draftsman with bruised feet and a shattered sense of reality. "The physical drop?" he finally asked, his gaze shifting slowly from the glowing tablet to my face, piercing straight through my corporate facade. 4 stories straight down the dark shaft, I replied honestly, refusing to sugarcoat the grueling physical reality of the escape plan. There's an old industrial maintenance ladder, bolted directly to the interior brickwork. I ran a structural decay algorithm on the materials just last week. The iron rungs are heavily rusted, and the surrounding mortar is deteriorating due to century-old moisture damage. But the tensile strength of the iron should hold our combined weight if we descend carefully and distribute the load. Once we reach the sub-basement, the limestone utility tunnels connect directly to the city's old storm drain system. That system empties out 3 blocks away, far beyond Belikov's established perimeter. Dominic's eyes darkened, the depths of his gaze swirling with a complex, unreadable emotion that made my breath catch. He reached out, his hand moving with that same deliberate, terrifyingly gentle slowness he possessed, and tucked a stray, sweat-dampened lock of hair behind my ear. His knuckles brushed briefly against my cold cheek. The searing contact sent a sudden jolt of electricity straight down my spine, exploding all the way to my toes. My breath hitched audibly in my throat. I froze, paralyzed by the deeply intimate gesture. It wasn't a sexual touch. It was a profound, possessive acknowledgement of my undeniable worth. "You are a remarkably dangerous woman, Clara Vance," Dominic whispered, the rough velvet of his voice washing over my hypersensitive skin. "Belikov brought suppressed assault rifles to a siege, but you brought the blueprints to his tomb." I couldn't look away from him. The sheer intensity of his gaze pinned me to the spot, trapping me more effectively than any physical restraint. The bone-deep exhaustion, the visceral fear of the armed men outside, the crushing, daily weight of my medical debts. All of it faded into the background noise, entirely eclipsed by the gravity of the man standing in front of me. I had spent my entire life trying to be invisible, trying to blend into the plaster and the scaffolding so the cruel world wouldn't crush me. But Dominic Rossini didn't just see me. He saw the brilliant, highly competent survivor hiding beneath the exhausted, disheveled exterior, and he valued her with absolute certainty. "I'm not dangerous," I replied, my voice trembling slightly, though not from fear this time. The vibration was born from a sudden fierce pride. I just know exactly how buildings are put together, and I know exactly how they fall apart. "Then let's tear this one down," Dominic said smoothly, his hand dropping away from my face, leaving a phantom trail of intense heat in its wake. He turned away from the marble table, his demeanor instantly shifting back to the cold, calculating syndicate boss preparing for war. "Pack up your digital schematics. We have a strict timeline to keep, and I do not intend to let a blunt instrument like Viktor Belikov dictate the rest of my evening." I nodded sharply, my fingers flying across the tablet to encrypt the proprietary files and shut down the active display. The harsh blue light vanished instantly, plunging the private dining area back into the soft, silver embrace of the ambient moonlight. I unplugged the external laser measure, wrapping the heavy cord with practiced, mechanical efficiency, my mind shifting gears smoothly from pure terror to cold, tactical execution. As I shoved the heavy tablet into the waterproof canvas satchel strapped tightly across my chest, I took one last look at the smooth stone table. In the dim light, the spilled wine was still slowly creeping across the fabric, a dark spreading stain that absolutely refused to be contained. I turned my back on it, leaving the ruined elegance behind. The exhausted, financially drowning girl who had been terrified of the shadows was gone, replaced by a competent woman willing to walk straight into the absolute darkness, guided by the cold, sovereign protection of a man who owned the night. I had just secured the thick brass buckle of the waterproof canvas saddle across my chest, the heavy strap biting sharply into my collarbone, when the atmosphere in the VIP suite fundamentally shifted. The suffocating silence that had settled over the dark luxury of room 404 was broken not by a violent sound from the hallway, but by a sharp, encrypted electronic buzz vibrating from the interior pocket of Dominic's bespoke charcoal suit. He didn't flinch. His hand moved with the fluid, calculated grace of a sovereign apex predator who fully expected the world to constantly attempt to betray him. He retrieved a sleek, matte black device from his jacket, not a standard commercial smartphone, but a heavy, military-grade communicator designed for uncompromised operational secrecy. His steely eyes scanned the small, glowing screen, and I watched the subtle, terrifying tightening of his strong jaw. The ambient moonlight pouring through the bulletproof glass caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone, highlighting a sudden, cold severity that made my breath hitch painfully in my throat. I could smell the faint trace of ozone in the air, the metallic tang of fear radiating off my own skin, starkly contrasted by the expensive, steadying scent of his aged whiskey cologne and the crisp starch of his shirt. "Viktor Belikov is not acting on mere aggressive instinct," Dominic stated, his low, gravelly voice completely devoid of any panic but laced with a lethal, chilling edge that demanded total attention. He walked past the polished stone table, his footsteps entirely soundless on the thick woolen carpet, and approached a massive, ornate gilded mirror hanging on the far wall of the polished, timber-paneled room. I watched in stunned, breathless fascination as he pressed his right thumb against a specific, intricate carving hidden within the wooden frame. A biometric scanner, invisible to the naked eye and absent from any of my digital schematics, chimed with a soft electronic whisper. The heavy mirror didn't swing open on hinges. Instead, the reflective surface instantly dissolved. The glass turned completely transparent, revealing a massive bank of high-definition security monitors embedded directly into the structural cavity of the wall. The depth of the technological integration was staggering. Behind the antique timber paneling of room 404 hid the nerve center of a military-grade fortress. The screens flickered to life in unison, bathing the dark, opulent luxury of the suite in a mosaic of pale, shifting, and deeply unsettling light. It was a live, closed-circuit tactical feed of the entire premises. The terrifying scale of his surveillance network was staggering to behold. Dominic Rossini didn't just possess a hidden, fortified sanctuary. He maintained unrivaled visual command over the entire historic property. From the grand chandeliers in the main foyer to the damp, forgotten corners of the underground parking garage, nothing escaped his reach. I took a hesitant, trembling step closer, my bruised bare feet sinking deep into the plush woven rug. My wide eyes drawn to the grid of cameras currently hovering the main lobby and the primary western stairwell. What I saw playing out on those silent monitors made the blood instantly crystallize in my veins. The initial wave of heavily armed thugs had not simply moved on to blindly search the upper floors. They were systematically, brutally dismantling the building's primary egress points. "They are welding the fire doors shut," I whispered, the profound shock rendering my voice thin, ragged, and fragile. On the lower left monitor, two massive men dressed in dark tactical gear were operating a heavy-duty portable acetylene torch, physically fusing the thick steel emergency doors of the central stairwell directly to their reinforced frames. The blinding white and blue sparks showered over the expensive imported marble foyer, leaving permanent, ugly black scorch marks on the century-old masonry. Every single shower of sparks felt like a physical blow to my chest. They were locking us in, slowly sealing off every viable artery of the historic property. "That is not all they are doing to your building, Clara?" Dominic pointed a long, elegant finger toward a central feed displaying the main elevator banks on the ground floor. My stomach plummeted into a cold, bottomless, nauseating abyss. Belikov's ruthless enforcers were currently using industrial power drills to bore directly into the polished brass panels located between the heavy elevator doors. Into those fresh holes they were meticulously inserting thick, rectangular blocks of a dull gray chemical compound that I instantly recognized from my extensive days overseeing hazardous demolition sites. "Incendiary charges," I choked out, my hands instinctively flying up to my chest, my knuckles turning bone white as I gripped the strap of my satchel. "They are actively rigging the main elevator shafts with military-grade explosives." A secondary trap, Dominic analyzed with terrifying stoic calm, casually crossing his arms over his broad chest. The expensive fabric of his bespoke wool sleeve pulled tight over his biceps, a visual reminder of the immense, coiled physical power contained within his highly refined exterior. Belikov knows the layout of this historic hotel is a massive, unpredictable labyrinth. Instead of hunting blindly and risking an ambush, he is deliberately blocking the main elevator shafts and neutralizing the standard escape routes. He intends to turn the entire western wing into a sealed, pressurized kill box. Panic, raw, unadulterated, and violently acidic, surged back into the back of my throat, tasting heavily of copper and stale, recycled air. I didn't need to be a seasoned underworld tactician to understand the terrifying, inescapable physics of what I was currently looking at. I was an architectural draftsman. I understood atmospheric pressure, thermal load distribution, and the devastating mechanics of structural collapse. I spent my days analyzing stress points and calculating structural integrity for massive corporate renovations, never once imagining I would use those same equations to keep from being buried alive. Without asking for permission, my trembling hands fought with the heavy brass buckle of my canvas satchel. I frantically hauled the heavy tablet back out, my professional instincts entirely overriding my physical exhaustion. The harsh, clinical blue light of the screen flared against my pale face once more, as I hastily booted up the proprietary surveying software. My fingers, which had miraculously steadied just minutes ago, were shaking violently once more. But this time the tremor was fueled by pure, analytical horror, rather than blind, helpless terror. I rapidly synced my detailed digital schematics, with the spatial visual data playing out on Dominic's hidden monitors, meticulously overlaying the active camera locations directly onto my 3D wireframes. I zoomed in aggressively on the sub-basement level, the exact specific location where our previously proposed ghost route through the old dumbwaiter shaft was supposed to safely terminate. It is infinitely worse than just a physical blockade, I warned him, my voice rising in pitch as the brutal mathematical reality of Belikov's strategy became fatally clear on my screen. Dominic, look at the projected blast radius of those specific incendiary charges. He stepped closer, his imposing, towering frame hovering just inches over my shoulder. The rich, intoxicating scent of expensive bergamot and aged whiskey enveloped me entirely, acting as a strange, highly intimate grounding anchor in the very midst of my spiraling, suffocating anxiety. Show me the flaw, Clara. Military-grade incendiaries burn at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, I explained, my stylus tapping frantically against the reinforced glass of the tablet, highlighting the structural pillars. If they detonate those charges inside the main shafts, the massive thermal expansion will instantly blow out the primary ventilation headers located directly in the sub-basement. They aren't just trying to keep us from walking down the stairs. They are anticipating that anyone trapped up here will attempt to use the subterranean utility tunnels to escape the perimeter. They are deliberately funneling us directly into a lethal choke point. I pulled up the exact limestone utility layout we had confidently agreed upon moments ago. If we execute our original plan and take the dumbwaiter shaft all the way down to the sub-basement, the moment we step out into the storm drain access, we will be stepping into an active bottleneck. Belikov's men will either be waiting right there with suppressed rifles, or the immediate thermal backdraft from the elevator charges will completely suffocate us before we can even reach the street level. Our primary ghost route is compromised. The secure walls located just behind us suddenly felt significantly less like an impenetrable shield and much more like the heavy, suffocating lid of a sealed coffin. I stared at the complex digital schematics, the intricate lines and spatial vectors blurring rapidly as hot tears of sheer, helpless frustration violently pricked the corners of my eyes. I had perfected the habit of fading completely from view. I had painstakingly memorized every single inch of this massive building in order to save my own life from a mountain of crushing medical debt, from the quiet despair of being constantly overlooked. And now I was forced to stand here and watch it be methodically turned into an inescapable, burning tomb. They are destroying a historic architectural masterpiece, I murmured, my deep professional pride aching fiercely as another bright shower of welding sparks erupted on the cold security feed. The original limestone foundations. The historic structural integrity of the West Wing will be permanently, irreversibly compromised. I do not care about the limestone, Clara, Dominic said softly, his voice cutting through my despair with razor-sharp precision. He spared no glance for the violent monitors. He looked down at me, his intense stormsman gray eyes completely, unwaveringly focused on my pale, terrified face. I care exclusively about the woman currently holding the digital schematics. We are not dying in this building tonight. Dominic's gravelly declaration hung in the tense air of the VIP room, a sovereign, unbreakable vow that demanded my unquestioning belief. But belief alone wouldn't successfully breach a hardened perimeter, guarded by chemical fire and automatic weapons. I had to suppress my spiraling panic and use my intellect to forge a new path. We cannot drop to the sub-basement, I stated, my voice finally steadying as I brutally forced my exhausted brain to detach from the immediate terror and engage solely with the cold, unforgiving architectural mathematics of the structure. I swiped away the tears, my vision clearing, as the cold logic of engineering took over. But the physical verticality of the dumbwaiter shaft itself is still our only viable, hidden bypass. Dominic remained perfectly still, an apex predator patiently waiting for his chosen strategist to lay out the board. If the very bottom of the shaft is a confirmed death trap, where exactly does that leave us to exit, Miss Vance? I swiped aggressively across the tempered glass screen of the heavy tablet, zooming in heavily on the vertical cross-section of the historic hotel. I meticulously stripped away the cosmetic layers of 1920s decorative plaster, bypassed the 1950s acoustic tiling installations, until I finally reached the massive, highly detailed corporate renovation files from the late 1980s. I stared intently at the highlighted void space representing the old dumbwaiter shaft, My eyes traced the specific geometric lines upward from the heavily compromised sub-basement, past the guarded ground floor lobby, and stopped abruptly at the second-level mezzanine. Here, I breathed out, the sudden realization striking me with the profound force of a physical revelation. I tapped the screen emphatically, highlighting a dense, incredibly complex cluster of digital lines that horizontally intersected the vertical shaft. I told you earlier that during the massive 1980s corporate renovation, the old smuggler's corridor was officially sealed off. But the contractors didn't just leave that empty void space completely alone. Using my layout knowledge to find a hidden loophole was my true specialty. They repurposed it. Dominic leaned over the smooth table again, his broad, incredibly solid shoulder brushing lightly against my bare arm. The intense electric warmth of his proximity sent a sharp, involuntary jolt through my completely exhausted body, but I stubbornly didn't pull away. The slow burn tension practically vibrating between us was an unspoken, highly charged dynamic, providing a strange, deeply intimate comfort in the profound darkness. His calculating gaze tracked my moving fingers, his unwavering focus validating my intellect in a way I hadn't experienced in years. For what purpose? Data and heavy-duty power distribution, I replied, a bright spark of genuine, undeniable professional triumph overriding my physical exhaustion. The Grand Plaza isn't just a historic hotel. It's a modern high-tech corporate hub. The holding company needed to run massive, industrial-grade commercial wiring across the entire width of the building, without destroying the regulated historic aesthetic of the public hallways. So, they utilized the forgotten dumbwaiter shaft. Specifically, right at the second-floor mezzanine level, the vertical shaft directly intersects with a massive horizontal drop ceiling cavity. It was entirely converted to house security wiring and high-tension fiber optic conduits. I manipulated the 3D model with practiced efficiency, rotating the structure so Dominic could clearly see the critical intersection of the hidden pathways. If we descend the dumbwaiter shaft from this specific floor, we don't go all the way down to the lethal sub-basement trap. We stop our descent exactly 22 feet down. Right at the second-floor junction, we can physically breach the cheap interior drywall from inside the shaft and pull ourselves directly into the horizontal ceiling conduits. Dominic's storm gray eyes studied the glowing wireframe, his brilliant tactical mind immediately processing the severe spatial logistics. You are proposing that we crawl horizontally through the suspended ceiling of the second floor. Exactly, I confirmed, my professional confidence firmly solidifying into unshakable certainty. The heavy conduits run perfectly horizontally across the entire mezzanine, crossing directly over the massive, open expanse of the grand ballroom and terminating safely in the eastern wing, a full city block away from Belikov's armed secondary trap in the west wing. We bypassed the compromised main elevator shafts entirely, remaining completely invisible and suspended safely above their heads. He slowly turned his piercing gaze away from the digital screen to meet my face. The heavy silence in the room returned, broken only by the faint, electric hum of the hidden security monitors embedded in the wall. A standard drop ceiling cavity in a historic building is rarely, if ever, designed to properly support the dynamic weight of a human being, Clara. If the drywall suspension collapses, while we are traversing the open expanse of the grand ballroom, we will fall 20 vertical feet directly onto the hard marble floor, assuming Viktor Belikov's men do not simply shoot us out of the air first. It was a highly valid, potentially lethal concern, but I was entirely ready to counter it. I was a meticulously trained architectural draftsman, and I did not gamble blindly with structural integrity. I tapped a hidden submenu on the tablet's interface, pulling up the precise material specifications and rigorous stress test data I had personally logged just 2 weeks ago. It is not a standard flimsy commercial drywall suspension, I explained, the words flowing with crisp technical precision. The corporate holding company intentionally installed heavy-duty, industrial steel cable trays to safely support the massive bundles of security wiring. The primary horizontal conduits are anchored directly into the original 1922 limestone joists, using high-grade expansion bolts. I ran the complex tensile strength calculations myself. The steel cable trays can safely support over 800 pounds of dynamic load per linear foot. As long as we stay strictly on the central, reinforced wiring path and do not accidentally step off onto the fragile acoustic tiles, the structure will easily hold our combined weight without a single betraying groan. I looked up, boldly meeting his terrifying, penetrating stare without flinching. I know this building, Dominic. I know exactly what it can endure, and I know exactly what it can carry. Dominic Rossini didn't say a word for a long, agonizingly slow moment. He simply looked down at me, a profound, almost reverent respect visibly softening the harsh, lethal, stoic lines of his aristocratic face. He wasn't just casually accepting my desperate strategic plan. He was fundamentally acknowledging me as a highly capable equal partner in our mutual survival. The massive, glaring class disparity between the sovereign, untouchable billionaire and the financially drowning corporate employee temporarily vanished, replaced by an undeniable, powerful mutual reliance. Then we confidently take the security wiring conduits, Dominic finally stated, his voice a low, deeply intimate rumble that vibrated pleasantly deep within my chest. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers gently closing the protective cover of my heavy tablet, instantly plunging us away from the clinical blue light and safely back into the intimate, quiet silver glow of the filtered moon. Pack your gear tightly, Clara. It is time to leave the sanctuary. I nodded sharply, slipping the heavy tablet securely back into my canvas satchel and pulling the thick strap tight across my chest. My heart was a frantic, hammering drum against my ribs, the paralyzing terror of stepping back out into the violent, unpredictable world violently warring, with the profound safety I felt standing right next to him. Dominic moved with silent grace back to the door, his large hand resting confidently on the secondary security deadbolt. He looked back at me one last time, his metallic eyes silently promising unwavering, sovereign protection. I took a deep, shuddering breath, finally ready to guide the most dangerous man in the city through the hidden bones of the ancient hotel. The heavy mahogany door opened with barely a whisper, its custom hinges gliding silently as Dominic pulled it back just enough for us to slip through. The immediate transition from the secure, climate-controlled sanctuary of room 404 back out into the freezing, devastated corridor of the 4th floor was a brutal shock to my system. The air tasted sharp and acrid, thick with the metallic stench of the acetylene torches, being used to weld the fire door shut somewhere in the distance. The brutal reality of Viktor Belikov's siege was inescapable. I clutched my canvas satchel tightly against my chest, my bare, bruised feet silently meeting the freezing marble floor. The contrast between the thick woolen carpet of the VIP suite and this unforgiving stone sent a violent shiver up my spine, but I forced my jaw to lock. There was no room for biological weakness now. My survival depended on cold logic and the precise application of my architectural expertise. Dominic moved ahead of me, a phantom in the dim amber glow of the emergency lights. Before we had left the suite, he had retrieved a heavy wool coat from the hidden closet, draping it over his arm with casual, effortless grace, despite the lethal circumstances. His broad shoulders shielded my line of sight as we glided down the hallway, staying flush against the historic plaster walls to avoid casting shadows. We bypassed the splintered oak frames of the guest rooms Belikov's men had already destroyed, the shattered glass crunching faintly under Dominic's leather shoes. I followed exactly in his footsteps, placing my bare soles where he stepped, relying entirely on his masterful command of the environment. Every deliberate move he made calculated the physics of the hallway, neutralizing the threat before it could materialize. We reached the double-wide alcove near the center of the west wing. According to my digital schematics, this was the false wall hiding the original Prohibition-era dumbwaiter shaft. The cheap, modern drywall felt cold and porous beneath my fingertips as I traced the subtle, uneven seam where the original 1922 molding abruptly ended. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, visualizing the complex 3D wireframe I had memorized, calculating the exact spatial coordinates of the hidden cavity. I could see the layout as if it were drawn in glowing blue lines against the darkness of my eyelids, a perfect geometric puzzle waiting to be unraveled. Here, I whispered, tapping a specific, unmarked section of the plaster just below eye level. The industrial steel framework is anchored at the corners, but the center panel is just half-inch gypsum board. If we breach it precisely here, we bypass the primary support studs entirely. Dominic didn't hesitate. He didn't question my architectural geometry or demand further explanation. He handed me his heavy wool coat, the immense weight of the premium fabric nearly buckling my exhausted arms, and stepped up to the wall. He raised his right arm, his movements tightly coiled and brutally efficient, and drove his elbow directly into the exact spot I had indicated. The drywall yielded with a dull, hollow crunch, the sound completely muffled by his expensive wool sleeve. He hooked his powerful fingers into the jagged opening and pulled back with terrifying, raw physical strength. Entire sections of the cheap plaster snapped and tore away, falling silently into the pitch-black abyss hidden behind the wall. The stale, freezing air of the century-old vertical shaft immediately rushed out, carrying the bitter scent of rusted iron, decaying mortar, and absolute, crushing darkness. "I will go first," Dominic stated, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the ambient light. "I will test the tensile strength of the iron rungs before you commit your weight. When I signal, you follow. Place your hands directly on the vertical rails, not the horizontal steps. Rusted iron is notoriously brittle in the center." I nodded, my heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs as I peered into the suffocating gloom. Dominic slipped effortlessly through the jagged breach, his tall, imposing frame swallowed whole by the darkness. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, I was left standing alone in the freezing hallway, the distant, muffled shouts of Belikov's enforcers echoing from the lower levels. They were getting closer. I could hear the brutal thud of doors being kicked open, the splintering of wood accompanied by violent curses. Then, 2 sharp rhythmic taps echoed from the iron structure inside the shaft. The signal. He was ready for me. I shoved the heavy wool coat through the opening first, watching it vanish into the void, before awkwardly maneuvering my own trembling body into the tight, limestone foundation. The moment my bruised, bare feet found the first icy iron rung, total sensory deprivation crashed over me. The darkness was absolute, thick and impenetrable, pressing against my eyes until bright, phantom colors began to burst in my peripheral vision. I gripped the vertical rails with desperate, white-knuckled intensity, the rough, oxidized metal biting sharply into my soft palms. The descent was a grueling, agonizing exercise in blind trust. The shaft was incredibly narrow, the ancient brickwork scraping harshly against my shoulders as I slowly lowered myself down, 22 vertical feet into the hidden bones of the historic hotel. "I have you," a deep, resonant voice murmured from the absolute darkness directly below me. A large, impossibly warm hand wrapped firmly around my left ankle, guiding my trembling foot down to the next stable rung. The searing contact of Dominic's palm against my freezing skin sent a massive jolt of electricity shooting straight up my leg, temporarily overriding the primal terror of the void. He was right there. He hadn't just descended to test the structure. He was actively acting as my physical anchor, matching my slow, terrified pace exactly. Every time my foot slipped on the damp, decaying iron, his firm grip caught me, his immense physical power providing an unyielding, protective safety net in the middle of a literal death trap. 20 feet down, I breathed out, my voice echoing strangely against the tight limestone walls. The dust was thick in my throat, tasting of earth and forgotten decades. The junction should be right below us. It intersects the horizontal ceiling cavity of the second-floor mezzanine. "I see the access panel," Dominic replied softly. The subtle, metallic screech of hinges protesting against decades of neglect vibrated through the ladder. A faint, ambient glow spilled into the vertical shaft as Dominic forced open the secondary maintenance hatch. I climbed down the final few rungs, my exhausted, trembling muscles screaming in protest, until I stood precariously beside him on the narrow, structural ledge. Before us stretched the massive, horizontal drop-ceiling cavity that hung directly over the hotel's grand ballroom. It was an architectural nightmare, a claustrophobic crawl space densely packed with industrial HVAC ductwork, heavy-duty sprinkler pipes, and the massive steel cable trays I had identified on my tablet. The air was incredibly stagnant, heavily pressurized, and thick with fiberglass insulation dust. But to my desperate, analytical eyes, the thick, reinforced steel trays running perfectly straight into the distance looked like a golden highway to salvation. "We stay entirely on the central tray," I instructed, my professional focus completely overriding my physical discomfort as I pointed to the wide, galvanized steel channel, bolted securely to the limestone joists above. "Do not let any weight transfer to the acoustic tiles on either side. They are suspended by thin aluminum grids that will instantly buckle." Dominic simply nodded, passing me his heavy wool coat once more before smoothly hauling his large frame up onto the steel tray. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of a predator, navigating its natural habitat, his bespoke suit absorbing the grime and dust without a single complaint. I followed closely behind, climbing onto the cold, rigid metal. The tray was barely 3 feet wide, packed with thick, rubberized bundles of fiber optic cables and high-tension security wiring. I had to flatten my body completely against the hard conduits, dragging myself forward on my forearms and bruised knees, the thick strap of my canvas satchel digging painfully into my shoulder blade with every inch gained. We crawled horizontally for what felt like hours, the absolute darkness of the cavity broken only by the thin, irregular slivers of light bleeding up through the seams of the acoustic ceiling tiles directly below us. The physical exertion was devastating. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, the fiberglass dust burning my lungs and stinging my eyes. The muscles in my arms and legs screamed with a fiery lactic acid burn, a testament to how far beyond my normal limits I was pushing myself. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. The primal fear of what Viktor Belikov was doing to the rest of the building pushed me forward. My survival instinct inextricably linked to the silent, powerful man moving steadily just a few feet ahead of me. Suddenly Dominic froze. His hands shot out behind him, his long fingers closing in a sharp, definitive fist. The universal tactical signal to halt. I stopped instantly, pressing my face flat against the cold rubber wiring, my heart performing a frantic, agonizing sprint against the steel cable trays. Voices. Angry guttural shouts echoed from the massive expanse of the grand ballroom, located roughly 20 vertical feet directly beneath our fragile suspended pathway. Tear down the temporary scaffolding. Check the catering kitchens. I shifted my weight infinitesimally, trying to alleviate the sharp pain of a cable tie digging into my rib cage. It was a fatal microscopic error. The toe of my bare foot slid off the edge of the steel tray, grazing the surface of a fragile acoustic tile. The dry, brittle gypsum board let out a faint, terrifyingly audible scrape that screamed like a siren in a silent room. Before I could even draw a breath to gasp, Dominic shifted backward with blinding, fluid speed. He didn't hesitate or calculate the risk to his own balance. He grabbed my shoulders, violently pulling my body forward, and pressing me completely flat against the steel tray, instantly covering my mouth with his large, gloved hand. The overwhelming weight of his solid chest pressed firmly against my back, trapping me in a highly intimate, inescapable vice of sovereign protection. I froze, entirely paralyzed by the explosive combination of absolute terror and the searing, electric heat radiating from his body. His face was buried in my neck, his hot breath ghosting across my sensitized skin as we both lay perfectly, terrifyingly still. The scent of bergamot and aged whiskey completely enveloped me, cutting through the stifling smell of fiberglass and dust. My frantic, hammering heartbeat echoed loudly in my own ears, and for a wild second, I was certain the armed men below could hear the violent rhythm of my pulse. "Did you hear that?" A heavy voice drifted up through the ceiling tiles, sounding agonizingly close. The blinding beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight swept across the floor below, the harsh white light bleeding aggressively through the narrow seams of the tiles just inches from my face. "Hear what?" "It's rats. The whole historic wing is infested." Another voice replied dismissively, accompanied by the brutal sound of a heavy table being violently overturned and crashing against the marble floor. Belikov said the target is trapped in the west elevator banks. Head toward the lobby. The heavy synchronized thud of combat boots slowly began to recede, moving away from our position and echoing distantly into the main foyer. The blinding flashlight beam vanished, leaving us plunged back into the suffocating, dusty darkness. Dominic didn't release me immediately. He remained pressed tightly against my back for another full minute, his hands still covering my mouth, his absolute, unshakable physical command acting as a grounding anchor for my shattered nerves. The slow burn tension between us, which had been simmering quietly in the VIP suite, violently ignited in the cramped, terrifying space. It was an unspoken, hypercharged dynamic, a silent acknowledgement of the sheer, intimate vulnerability we were sharing. I was entirely at his mercy, suspended 20 feet in the air on a metal tray, and yet I had never felt a more profound, absolute sense of safety in my entire life. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand from my mouth. He shifted his weight off my back, the sudden absence of his heat leaving me feeling strangely cold and exposed despite the stifling air of the cavity. "Breathe, Clara," he whispered, his low voice vibrating right next to my ear, sending a fresh cascade of shivers down my spine. "We are clear. The eastern termination point is just 30 yards ahead." I dragged a ragged, shuddering breath into my burning lungs, nodding numbly as I forced my trembling muscles back into motion. We resumed our grueling crawl, navigating the final stretch of the steel cable trays until the horizontal cavity finally ended abruptly against a solid limestone firewall. A heavy industrial maintenance grate was bolted into the masonry, providing access to the old Eastern's utility corridors that had been abandoned during the modernization. Dominic didn't wait for my architectural assessment. He positioned his shoulders against the thick iron grate and shoved with a brutal, terrifying display of raw power. The heavy bolts shrieked in protest before shearing completely off, the grate falling forward and crashing loudly onto the concrete floor of the hidden utility room below. We didn't care about the noise anymore. We were a full city block away from Belikov's killbox, entirely outside the perimeter of the secondary trap. He dropped down into the dark room first, landing with absolute silence despite his size. I dragged myself to the edge of the opening, my arms shaking so violently I could barely support my own weight. I didn't have to climb down. Dominic simply reached up, his large hands wrapping firmly around my waist, and effortlessly pulled me out of the ceiling. For a brief, breathless second, my body slid completely against his as he lowered me to the solid concrete, the friction sending a massive, electric shockwave through every nerve ending I possessed. He didn't let go of my waist immediately, his striking gaze meeting mine in the pitch-black room, silently confirming that the brutal ordeal of the crawl was finally over. "We are out," he stated quietly, finally stepping back to allow me room to breathe. I leaned back against the cold concrete wall, my entire body violently convulsing as the massive adrenaline dump finally, irrevocably crashed. My teeth chattered uncontrollably, my skin clammy and freezing as the bitter, icy draft from the nearby loading dock doors swept through the uninsulated utility room. The sheer, overwhelming exhaustion was a physical weight, crushing my bones and blurring my vision. I had survived, but the toll on my physical and mental endurance was devastating. Before I could completely collapse, a sudden, heavy warmth descended over my shaking shoulders. Dominic stepped into my personal space, unfolding the heavy wool coat he had carried through the dust and the darkness, and wrapped it securely around my trembling frame. The fabric was incredibly thick, soft, and completely immaculate, carrying the concentrated, grounding scent of his bespoke cologne. It settled onto my spine like a familiar, suffocating blanket of pure protection, instantly chasing away the bitter chill of the concrete room. He pulled the wide lapels together at my throat, his knuckles brushing gently against my cold skin, a gesture so profoundly intimate and caring that hot, tears finally spilled over my eyelashes. "You are safe now, Clara," he murmured, his voice softening into a register of protective warmth that stood in stark, magnificent contrast to the ruthless syndicate leader who had locked the heavy mahogany door an hour ago. He paid no mind to my disheveled state. He simply accepted my tears as the natural biological response to surviving a nightmare. "No one is going to hunt you anymore. You have my absolute word on that." I clutched the lapels of the tailored coat tightly in my bruised, dirty hands, burying my face briefly in the expensive fabric. The sheer relief was intoxicating, a powerful narcotic that instantly severed my lingering anxiety. I nodded against his chest, completely surrendering the exhausting burden of my independence to his sovereign authority. Dominic turned and pushed open the heavy steel exterior doors of the loading dock. The freezing, biting wind of the Boston night hit us instantly, but wrapped in his coat, I barely felt the chill. We stepped out into the dark, rain-slicked alleyway behind the eastern wing of the Grand Plaza. Waiting silently in the deep shadows of the brick walls was a massive, heavily armored black SUV, its engine idling with a low, predatory purr. Standing at absolute attention beside the rear passenger door was Matteo Moretti. Dominic's fiercely loyal chief of security was a highly disciplined, imposing figure, his posture radiating a quiet, exceptionally tactical lethality that perfectly mirrored his employer. Matteo didn't ask questions. He didn't look at my disheveled state or my bruised, bare feet. He simply opened the heavy, ballistic steel door and stepped back, a silent guardian facilitating our transition from danger to absolute sanctuary. Dominic guided me toward the vehicle with a firm, steady hand on the small of my back, a constant, reassuring pressure that anchored my fractured senses. I climbed into the spacious leather-scented interior of the SUV, sinking deeply into the plush seats. The premium wool pooled around my legs, a continuous source of intense, comforting heat against my shivering body. Dominic slid into the seat right next to me, the sheer size of his presence instantly filling the enclosed cabin. and pulled the armored door shut. The heavy pressurized thud of the steel sealing us inside severed the violent, chaotic world of the hotel from my reality completely. The ambient streetlights bled weakly through the tinted ballistic glass, casting long, moving shadows over his sharp, patrician features. As Mateo smoothly accelerated the vehicle into the dark, rainy streets, heading away from the flashing sirens that were just beginning to converge to targeted structure, I leaned my exhausted head back against the soft leather. I was financially ruined. My old corporate life was likely burned to the ground, and I was sitting in the back of an armored car with Boston's most feared apex predator. The sheer magnitude of my situation should have terrified me. Yet, as Dominic's hand reached across the center console, his long fingers gently resting over mine, I realized a terrifying, beautiful truth. The extreme safety fantasy I had secretly craved during all those grueling, lonely night shifts wasn't an illusion. It was sitting right beside me, holding my bruised hand in the dark. The city rushed by outside, cold and indifferent, but inside the armored walls of Dominic Rossini's protection, I had never been safer. The armored black SUV glided through the rain-slicked streets of Boston with the heavy, unshakable momentum of a battleship cutting through calm waters. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute, insulated from the howling autumn wind and the distant wail of emergency sirens converging on the hotel. I kept my head resting against the plush leather seat, my bruised body enveloped entirely in the pristine warmth of Dominic's bespoke overcoat. Every rotation of the tires carried me further away from the suffocating terror of the architectural void, but my mind was still frantically attempting to process the sheer magnitude of the shift. The transition from being a hunted, financially drowning draftsman to sitting beside the city's sovereign syndicate leader was a geopolitical earthquake I wasn't entirely equipped to handle. A chasm too wide to cross. I turned my head slightly, my exhausted eyes tracking the glowing city lights as they bled through the thick ballistic glass. We were ascending the steep, historic inclines of Beacon Hill. The neighborhood was a bastion of old money and impenetrable social elite, characterized by Federalist brick mansions, antique gas lamps, and a pervasive, chilling quiet that money alone could purchase. I had surveyed buildings in this district before, logging the structural data of the ultra-rich while carefully maintaining my invisibility. I knew the exact tensile strength of the wrought iron fences and the load-bearing capacity of the historic cobblestones. But I had never been invited behind the locked doors. I was a spectator, a worker ant mapping the gilded cage from the outside, always invisible. Beside me, Dominic Rossini radiated an aura of unshakable, absolute calm. He hadn't released his light, grounding hold on my hand. His long, elegant fingers remained loosely curled over my knuckles, the searing heat of his skin providing a constant, electric anchor to the present moment. He was staring out the opposite window, his sharp, aristocratic profile illuminated intermittently by the passing streetlights, his sharp gaze calculating the shifting variables of his empire. The massive, glaring class disparity between us was undeniable. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than my entire annual salary. I was shivering in a ruined olive green blouse, my bare feet covered in century-old limestone dust. Yet, he didn't look at me with the dismissive arrogance I had come to expect from the powerful men in the corporate construction industry. He held my hand with the profound, possessive care of a man who had personally chosen to pull me from the wreckage. A sovereign shield. The vehicle slowed, turning sharply into a private, unmarked alleyway before descending down a steep concrete ramp. Matteo Moretti navigated the tight subterranean structure with practiced, tactical precision. We passed through a series of heavily reinforced steel gates, the mechanical groan of the industrial motors, echoing in the cavernous underground garage. My architectural instincts instantly flared to life, automatically cataloging the extreme security measures. The concrete pillars were reinforced with titanium rebar. The overhead lighting was recessed behind shatterproof Lexan shielding. This wasn't just a luxury parking facility. It was a hardened bunker designed to withstand a coordinated military assault. A modern fortress. The SUV rolled to a smooth halt in front of a private elevator bank. Matteo killed the engine, the sudden silence hanging heavy in the cabin. Dominic released my hand, a brief, phantom chill instantly replacing his heat, and stepped out of the vehicle. He didn't wait for his chief of security to open my door. He walked around the rear of the armored car and pulled the heavy steel door open himself, extending a hand to me. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, the sheer, towering presence of him temporarily paralyzing my exhausted muscles. Then, I placed my trembling fingers into his palm. He pulled me up with effortless grace, steadying my swaying frame as my bruised, bare feet met the cold concrete floor. He never faltered. We approached the elevator. There were no buttons. Dominic simply stepped in front of a sleek black glass panel set flush into the masonry. A faint red laser swept across his eyes, the biometric scanner instantly recognizing the sovereign ruler of the fortress. The heavy steel doors slid open with a soft hydraulic hiss. The interior of the cab was lined in dark, polished timber and brushed steel, a subtle nod to the aesthetic of the VIP suite we had just escaped. "The ascent will be rapid," Dominic warned softly, stepping inside and guiding me in after him. He positioned himself slightly in front of me, his broad shoulders offering a protective buffer, as the doors sealed shut. The elevator shot upward with terrifying silent velocity. My stomach dropped, my ears popping as we bypassed dozens of floors in mere seconds. I clutched the lapels of his heavy wool coat tighter around my neck, the intoxicating scent of bergamot and aged whiskey, acting as a grounding focal point against the dizzying vertical momentum. I couldn't breathe. When the doors finally chimed and parted, the absolute contrast between the violent world I had just left and the sanctuary I was now entering nearly knocked the remaining breath from my lungs. We didn't step into a hallway. The elevator opened directly into the sprawling, breathtaking expanse of Dominic's private penthouse. The sheer scale of the architecture was staggering, a masterful symphony of modern luxury and unyielding structural dominance. Massive, floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire perimeter, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the glowing Boston skyline and the dark, churning waters of the Charles River. The interior was a study in high-contrast textures. Immaculate, pale granite floors polished to a mirror shine, juxtaposed against richly stained wood paneling and sprawling sections of thick woolen carpets. The ambient lighting was warm and golden, casting a soft, inviting glow over the bespoke imported leather furniture and the meticulously curated contemporary art pieces. Absolute power. It was silent, but unlike the heavy, suffocating silence of that deadly corridor, this silence was not empty. It was rich, secure, and profoundly domestic. "Buonasera, Don Dominic," a warm, remarkably steady voice called out from the direction of an expansive, open-concept kitchen. I flinched instinctively, my shattered nerves still primed for an ambush, but Dominic placed a calming hand squarely on my lower back. "Stand down, Clara. You are entirely safe here." A woman emerged from the shadows of the hallway, wiping her hands on a pristine white apron. Teresa Rossi was in her late 50s, possessing a maternal, commanding presence that seemed entirely unfazed by the sudden arrival of the city's most dangerous man in the middle of the night. She had kind, deeply intelligent brown eyes, her silver hair pulled back into a neat, practical bun. She radiated the fierce, unconditional loyalty of a woman who had spent decades managing the domestic heart of a powerful syndicate family. She was the anchor. Her gaze shifted from Dominic to me, taking in my disheveled, trembling form. She saw the ruined, dirt-streaked olive-green blouse beneath the oversized overcoat. She saw the violent smudges of fiberglass dust on my pale cheeks. But mostly, she looked down and saw my bruised, bleeding, bare feet standing on the immaculate granite floor. Teresa didn't gasp. She didn't ask a barrage of frantic, intrusive questions. She simply drew in a sharp breath, her maternal instincts instantly overriding whatever formal protocols existed in the penthouse. "Dio mio," she murmured, her voice dropping into a soft, rapid stream of her native tongue as she rushed forward. She didn't look to Dominic for permission. She completely bypassed the sovereign leader and reached out to gently cradle my cold, trembling hands in hers. "You are freezing, Bambina. You look like you have walked through a war zone." She mapped the route out of one, Teresa. Dominic replied quietly, his tone laced with a profound, undeniable respect that made my heart flutter wildly against my ribs. He stepped past us, removing his suit jacket with a weary roll of his broad shoulders. "We need hot water, clean towels, and the primary medical kit brought to my study immediately." "Of course." Teresa nodded sharply, releasing my hands and giving my arm a reassuring maternal squeeze. "I will also brew a pot of fresh chamomile tea, the real kind, imported from the old country, not the dust in the bags. It will calm the nervous system. You must sit down before you collapse, Signorina." I couldn't speak. The sudden overwhelming influx of domestic care was too stark a contrast to the brutal, life-or-death calculus I had been running for the past 2 hours. In the corporate world, if you showed weakness, you were devoured. You were deemed incompetent, a liability to the timeline. But here, in the heavily guarded epicenter of a criminal empire, I was being offered hot tea and soft towels simply because I was hurting. The extreme safety fantasy was wrapping its arms around me, and the tension that had been holding my shattered spine together finally began to dissolve. I was breaking. "Come with me, Clara," Dominic instructed, his voice breaking through my emotional paralysis. He didn't wait for my response. He simply turned and walked down a wide, softly lit corridor, fully expecting me to follow. And I did. I walked across the pale granite, my bare feet leaving faint, dusty footprints on the pristine stone, silently allowing the undisputed king of the underworld to lead me deeper into his sanctuary. I followed him. Dominic led me to a set of heavy double doors terminating the long stretch of the corridor. Unlike the highly modernized, sleek aesthetic of the main living space, these doors were crafted from solid, antique hardwood, intricately carved and radiating a sense of historic permanence. He pushed them open, revealing his private study. The room was a breathtaking sanctuary of dark, masculine intellect. 3 walls were lined floor to ceiling with massive, custom-built timber bookshelves, groaning under the weight of thousands of rare, leather-bound volumes, architectural folios, and historical texts. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper, rich tobacco, and the ever-present, grounding aroma of his bergamot cologne. At the center of the room sat a massive, commanding desk carved from a single slab of raw-edge obsidian, overlooking another sprawling expanse of bulletproof glass that framed the glittering, rain-swept city below. "Sit," Dominic commanded softly, gesturing toward a pair of oversized, deep-tufted leather armchairs positioned near the window. I moved mechanically, the physical toll of the night finally catching up to my muscles, in a cascading wave of severe lactic acid burn. I sank into the supple leather, the chair swallowing my small frame. I kept the heavy wool coat wrapped tightly around my shoulders, my bruised feet hovering awkwardly over the antique Persian rug. I felt entirely out of place, a shattered, dirty remnant of the chaotic working class intruding upon an untouchable aristocratic realm. Completely ruined. A moment later, Teresa entered the study, her footsteps entirely silent. She carried a heavy silver tray, placing it carefully onto the low-polished timber table between the armchairs. On the tray sat a steaming porcelain teapot, 2 delicate cups, and a sleek, stainless steel medical kit that looked like it belonged in a high-end surgical theater rather than a home office. "The chamomile tea needs exactly 2 more minutes to steep, Don Dominic," the housekeeper murmured, her kind eyes darting to my pale face with genuine concern. "Shall I draw a hot bath for the signorina in the guest wing?" "Yes," Dominic replied, taking his intense focus off me. "Ensure the water temperature is moderate. We do not want to shock her system." "Thank you, Teresa. That will be all for tonight." She gave a slight, respectful bow and quietly exited, the antique panels clicking shut behind her, sealing us inside the hushed, acoustic perfection of the study. The silence here was different from the terrifying stillness of the Grand Plaza. It was a weighted, deliberate quiet, designed for intense focus and absolute privacy. No one could enter. Dominic didn't immediately pour the chamomile tea. Instead, he bypassed his own armchair and pulled a low, leather-upholstered ottoman directly in front of my seat. He sat down, his imposing, broad-shouldered frame bringing him level with my knees. The sheer physical proximity of him was overwhelming. The bespoke charcoal suit he wore had barely wrinkled during our grueling escape through the ceiling crawl spaces, a testament to the supernatural control he exerted over his environment. He reached for the stainless steel medical kit, the metal clasps snapping open with a crisp, efficient sound. "Give me your left arm, Clara." I blinked, momentarily confused by the request. My brain was operating on a severe delay, the adrenaline crash rendering my cognitive processing sluggish. I slowly lifted my left arm from beneath the folds of the heavy wool coat. It was only then that I noticed the damage. The raw, stinging scrape along the underside of my wrist hidden beneath the coat. During my frantic, panicked scramble across the rusted iron rungs of the dumbwaiter shaft, I had badly scraped the delicate skin. The jagged metal had torn through the sleeve of my olive green blouse, leaving a raw, bleeding abrasion roughly 3 inches long. The blood had already begun to coagulate, mixing with the dark, century-old limestone dust to form an ugly, painful crust. In the heat of the survival calculations, my brain had completely blocked out the pain signals. Now, staring at the wound, it began to throb with a sharp, localized heat. It burned. Dominic's jaw tightened imperceptibly as he assessed the injury. He didn't sigh or offer false, soothing platitudes. He operated with the cold, precise efficiency of a man intimately acquainted with the mechanics of physical trauma. He extracted a square of soft gauze and a small amber glass bottle of high-grade antiseptic from the kit. "This is going to burn," he warned, his voice a low, intimate rumble that vibrated pleasantly against my frayed nerves. "I can do it myself," I protested weakly, my ingrained stubborn independence reflexively kicking in. For years, I had been completely alone, managing my mother's illness, fighting the predatory billing departments of hospitals, and patching up my own physical and emotional wounds. The idea of allowing a sovereign cartel leader to personally clean my cuts was a terrifying surrender of control. I reached for the soft gauze with my opposite hand, my fingers trembling slightly. I pulled away. Dominic didn't let me take it. His large, incredibly warm hand shot out, gently but immovably capturing my shaking fingers. The contact was electric, a massive jolt of highly charged energy shooting straight up my arm, completely overriding the dull throb of the scrape. His thumb brushed slowly across my knuckles, the calloused texture of his skin contrasting sharply with the refined elegance of his bespoke suit. "You have spent the entire night utilizing your intellect to protect us," Dominic stated, his commanding stare locking onto mine with absolute, unyielding command. The intense, slow-burn tension in the room thickened, transforming the air into something heavy and intoxicating. "You calculated the structural load of the steel cable trays. You navigated the blind spots of the digital schematics. You carried the heavy burden of our survival. Now, Clara, it is my turn to carry the burden. Let me." The sheer, devastating validation in his words shattered the last fragile barrier of my pride. He wasn't demanding submission. He was offering a profound, equitable partnership. I slowly relaxed my fingers, allowing my bruised hand to rest completely within his powerful, protective grip. I surrendered. Dominic uncapped the amber bottle, saturating the soft gauze with the clear antiseptic fluid. With meticulous, agonizingly slow care, he pressed the damp fabric to my torn skin. The sudden sharp sting made me hiss, my breath hitching audibly in the quiet study. My instinct was to jerk my arm away, but his grip remained incredibly steady, holding me firmly in place without exerting any painful pressure. He began to wipe away the dark limestone dust and dried blood, his movements surprisingly gentle for a man whose reputation was built on ruthless violence. "I shouldn't have been in that hallway," I whispered, staring down at his long, elegant fingers as they worked. The need to confess, to lay bare the pathetic reality of my situation, swelled uncontrollably in my chest. If I had just clocked out at 5 like the rest of the corporate surveying team, none of this would have happened. But I needed the overtime pay, the medical debt from my mother's hospice care. It's a relentless tide, Dominic. It just keeps multiplying. I thought if I stayed hidden, if I mapped the blind spots and delivered the perfect digital schematics, I could outrun the ruin. But I just ran straight into Viktor Belikov instead. Dominic paused, the blood-stained gauze hovering just above my wrist. He looked up, his expression hardening into a mask of stoic, terrifying resolve. "Belikov is a consequence of my world bleeding into yours, Clara. You are not responsible for the violence of men who lack discipline. You are only responsible for the brilliant, tactical mind that navigated us out of the kill box. Your corporate employers severely underestimate your value. They see a draftsman. I see a highly competent architect who understands the fundamental anatomy of survival." He discarded the soiled gauze into a small medical waste receptacle and retrieved a fresh, sterile bandage. As he carefully aligned the adhesive edges over the clean scrape, his thumb deliberately stroked the unbroken skin on the inside of my wrist, right over my rapidly beating pulse. The gesture was intensely intimate, a physical acknowledgement of the life force he had just protected. It anchored me. "Why didn't you just leave me in the corridor?" I asked, the question slipping out before my analytical filter could stop it. "When I ran toward room 404, you could have kept the door locked. You had a secure, soundproof bunker. By pulling me inside, you risked exposing your position to an armed death squad. From a purely strategic standpoint, I was a massive liability." Dominic smoothed the edges of the bandage, his touch lingering against my skin for a long, highly charged moment before he finally released my arm. He leaned back slightly on the leather ottoman, his stormy irises entirely stripped of their usual terrifying authority. "From a purely strategic standpoint, perhaps," he conceded, his voice dropping into a register so low it felt like a physical vibration in the quiet study. But I do not govern my empire solely through cold mechanical equations, Clara. I read people just as precisely as you read the bones of a building. When I watched you running down that freezing marble hallway in your bare feet, clutching your tablet like a shield, I did not see a liability. I saw a woman who possessed the sheer terrifying courage to calculate the odds of her own survival while staring down the barrel of an automatic weapon. You did not scream. You did not freeze. You adapted. He reached for the silver tray, lifting the porcelain teapot, and pouring the steeped golden liquid into the delicate cups. The fragrant, earthy aroma of the imported chamomile tea instantly filled the space between us, acting as a soothing, olfactory anchor. He handed me a cup, the warm porcelain radiating a comforting heat against my cold, bruised palms. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who claim to be loyal, but who break the moment the structural integrity of their world is tested. Dominic continued, picking up his own cup but not breaking eye contact. You were completely shattered by exhaustion, suffocating under the weight of financial debt, and hunted by violent men. And yet, you built a bridge out of the darkness for both of us. I did not pull you into my VIP room out of charity, Clara. I pulled you in because I recognized an equal. I brought the porcelain cup to my lips. My hands finally steady and took a slow sip. The hot chamomile tea flowed down my throat, a rich, floral warmth that began to methodically thaw the icy knot of terror that had been sitting in my chest for the past 2 hours. I closed my eyes, letting the profound, absolute truth of his words wash over me. For 28 years, I had perfected the practice of blending into the plaster, believing that if I simply worked hard enough and stayed out of the way, I would eventually earn my safety. I had been wrong. Genuine safety was not the absence of danger. It was sitting in a fortified penthouse, drinking imported tea with a sovereign protector who saw the exact worth of my highly capable mind. I was seen. What happens now? I asked softly, opening my eyes to look at the sprawling, glittering expanse of the Boston skyline through the massive windows. Out there, in the cold and the rain, Viktor Belikov was likely still tearing apart the historic hotel, furious that his prey had vanished like a ghost. The corporate holding company would discover the devastating architectural damage by morning. My firm would be interrogated. My old life was effectively over, a complete erasure. Dominic took a sip of his tea, his sharp, aristocratic features relaxing into a look of absolute terrifying certainty. He set the cup down on the mahogany table with a quiet, decisive click. Now, Miss Vance, Dominic stated, the sheer weight of his sovereign authority filling the acoustic perfection of the study. We rewrite the digital schematics of your life. The men who hunted you tonight will be legally and physically dismantled by my syndicate. Your medical debts are no longer a variable in your equation. You are under my absolute protection. And tomorrow, we will begin discussing your new role as the lead architectural engineer for the Rossini Empire. I stared at the man sitting before me, the slow burn tension in the room finally settling into a deep, unwavering mutual trust. The heavy wool coat wrapped around my shoulders felt less like a temporary shield and more like a permanent, unbreakable vow. The extreme safety fantasy I had desperately dreamed of was no longer an illusion. It was my new, undeniable reality. And as Dominic reached out, his long fingers gently brushing a stray, plaster-dusted lock of hair from my cheek, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never have to be invisible again. I was home. The first 72 hours passed in a quiet, heavily guarded haze of restorative sleep and gentle care. Teresa essentially functioned as my maternal warden, coaxing me to eat rich, nourishing broths and ensuring the scrape on my wrist remained meticulously bandaged until the raw, angry redness faded into a dull, healing pink. Dominic did not pressure me. He offered me the profound luxury of space, working silently from his study while leaving his massive double doors open. A subtle, unspoken reminder that his protection was absolute, but never confining. By the fourth morning, the violent tremors in my hands had completely vanished, replaced by a quiet, steady strength I hadn't felt in years. I was healing. 6 months passed like a steady healing tide. The brutal, freezing rain of that October night had long since given way to the soft, golden warmth of a Boston spring. The transition over the last half-year had been seamless, a slow, meticulous testament to the brutal efficiency of the empire I was now fundamentally a part of. The first few weeks had been a blur of exhausted recovery and disbelief. I vividly remembered waking up to the smell of hot chamomile tea, that Teresa Rossi brewed with maternal care. The soft, heavy cashmere throws wrapped around my shivering shoulders, replacing the freezing, dusty memories of the steel cable trays at the Grand Plaza Hotel. But more than the physical warmth, it was the absolute, staggering weight of a single piece of paper that had permanently changed my reality. The zero balance statement. I had stared at the official hospital document, sitting on the massive granite kitchen island, tracing the printed ink that proved the complete eradication of my mother's crushing medical debts. They were paid in full, quietly and decisively, by Dominic's holding companies. Dominic hadn't just paid it off. His legal team had systematically audited the predatory hospital administrators, terrifying them into issuing a formal apology for their exorbitant overcharges. The heavy emotional armor I had worn for decades, the persistent, suffocating panic of financial ruin, had finally dissolved into nothingness. I had outgrown being merely a fragile civilian hiding behind a heavy door anymore. Over these past 6 months, I had been officially employed as the lead estate architect for the Rossini Syndicate, my sharp expertise fully integrated into the lifeblood of his operations. Tonight, we were gathered in the Syndicate's primary tactical boardroom, a highly secure, subterranean bunker located deep beneath the Beacon Hill estate, entirely isolated from the outside world by feet of titanium-reinforced concrete and state-of-the-art acoustic dampening panels. The silence in the boardroom was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and tasted of stale espresso, sharp legal ink, and the impending ruin of our enemies. I stood confidently at the head of a massive, polished mahogany conference table, my posture straight, and my shoulders relaxed beneath the crisp fabric of my tailored silk blouse. For 28 years, I had perfected the practice of blending into the plaster and scaffolding of male-dominated construction sites, keeping my head down and my voice soft to avoid drawing the predatory attention of arrogant project managers. My hands carried the tiny, faded scars of cheap drafting tools and careless labor. That fragile, financially drowning draftsman no longer existed. The woman standing in this war room was the lead architect of a sovereign empire, and I held the absolute attention of the most dangerous, highly capable legal and tactical minds in the city. Matteo Moretti sat to my immediate right, his imposing, highly disciplined frame perfectly still, as he analyzed the massive high-definition monitors mounted on the wall. Opposite him sat Dominic's elite team of corporate litigators and forensic accountants, men and women dressed in severe, expensive bespoke suits, their eyes sharp and hungry for leverage, and positioned opposite me at the table, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying sovereign command, sat Dominic Rossini. He leaned back in his leather chair, his long, elegant fingers steepled beneath his chin. The pristine lines of his charcoal tuxedo contrasted sharply with the dark, lethal energy he projected. His dark gaze studied my steady hands with a profound, unwavering respect that sent a constant, electric thrill straight down my spine. The structural integrity of a building is fundamentally incapable of keeping secrets. I began, my voice crisp, highly authoritative, and completely devoid of hesitation as I tapped the tempered glass of my tablet. People lie. Corporate holding companies forge documents, but the foundational matrix always tells the exact, unforgiving truth. I swiped my stylus across the screen, projecting a massive, incredibly detailed 3D wireframe onto the primary monitors. It was the architectural blueprint of Viktor Belikov's most critical operational asset. A sprawling, heavily guarded industrial distribution center, located on the industrial edge of the eastern seaboard. Throughout these past 6 months, I had carefully analyzed the municipal zoning archives. I stated, my tone steady as I systematically dismantled the man who had hunted me. I cross-referenced decades of public building permits with the classified ground-penetrating radar scans Dominic's surveillance teams discreetly acquired. Viktor Belikov relies on brute force and intimidation, which makes him remarkably sloppy when it comes to sophisticated structural engineering. I zoomed in aggressively on the subterranean levels of the facility, illuminating the hidden depths of the compound. This distribution center officially operates as a commercial logistics hub, but my digital schematics reveal a massive, highly illegal structural deviation. In order to create hidden, climate-controlled vaults for his illicit syndicate operations, weapons trafficking, and unlicensed chemical storage, Belikov's contractors excavated an additional 40,000 square feet beneath the primary loading docks. I highlighted the compromised area, the glowing blue vectors shifting to a severe, flashing crimson. Are you absolutely certain the degradation is severe enough to warrant immediate federal intervention? One of the senior corporate litigators asked, his pen pausing over his legal pad, a skeptical frown marring his features. Belikov has deep pockets. He routinely pays off half the municipal inspectors in that district. He pays off the inspectors looking for fire code violations in the visible above-ground corridors. I countered smoothly, meeting the lawyer's gaze without a single flinch. My voice was a calm, lethal weapon. They never looked at the foundation. The hydrostatic pressure from the surrounding coastal groundwater is already causing severe foundation settlement. I tapped the screen again, plunging deep into the highly technical terminology that constituted my true weapon. The tensile shear stress on those compromised concrete pilings has completely exceeded the legal municipal safety threshold. Furthermore, to maintain the climate control in those hidden subterranean vaults, Belikov illegally tapped into the facility's main HVAC ventilation headers, entirely bypassing the commercial fire suppression systems. The building is a catastrophic structural failure waiting to happen. It is in direct, undeniable violation of over 30 severe federal and municipal building codes. I paused, letting the devastating reality of the architectural data settle over the heavy mahogany conference table. I wasn't suggesting an armed assault. I wasn't proposing a violent, chaotic street war that would put Dominic's men at risk of catching a bullet. I was handing them a perfectly calculated, undeniable legal guillotine. If we anonymously submit these precise digital schematics to the federal building inspector's office, accompanied by a highly detailed engineering stress analysis, I concluded, my tone dropping into a realm of cold, absolute finality, the federal authorities will not simply fine him. The severe, immediate threat to public safety supersedes any localized municipal bribery. It will compel them to condemn the entire property within 24 hours. They will initiate an emergency federal seizure of the facility, completely locking down the perimeter and freezing all assets trapped inside the hidden vaults. Viktor Belikov's primary operational hub will be entirely neutralized without us ever having to fire a single shot. I stared at the red zoning lines spreading across the digital schematics like blood seeping through gauze. It was a beautiful, clinical destruction. I was systematically dismantling the empire of the man who had ordered his heavily armed thugs to hunt me through the freezing, dusty ceiling crawl spaces. The primal, acidic terror I had felt that night was completely gone, replaced by the cold, empowering steel of poetic justice. I had weaponized my trauma, transforming my deep architectural expertise into a devastating blade. Dominic slowly lowered his hands, his broad shoulders shifting as he leaned forward into the ambient light of the monitors. His unwavering eyes remained entirely focused on my face with absolute command. The immense pride radiating from his gaze was a physical weight, wrapping around me in a warm, protective embrace. "You have mapped the exact coordinates of his ruin, Clara?" Dominic murmured, his low, gravelly voice cutting through the hushed awe of the boardroom. He ignored the legal team. His sovereign attention was entirely, possessively focused on me. "You have handed us the keys to his tomb." The immediate aftermath of my architectural presentation was a masterclass in ruthless, highly synchronized syndicate execution. The imposing conference room door remained firmly closed as Dominic's elite legal and tactical teams instantly mobilized, seamlessly transitioning my structural evidence into devastating, real-world consequences. I took a step back from the head of the conference table, smoothly sliding my tablet into my canvas satchel, and watched the sovereign machinery of Dominic Rossini's empire operate at full, terrifying capacity. Dominic did not hesitate. He utilized the precise structural leverage and the irrefutable legal evidence I had meticulously provided to systematically dismantle Viktor Belikov's syndicate. The execution was cold, bureaucratic, and utterly inescapable. While Belikov had spent his entire criminal career preparing for violent armed conflicts and aggressive territorial disputes, he was fundamentally incapable of fighting a war, waged through municipal zoning injunctions, federal safety mandates, and catastrophic engineering audits. From his commanding position at the head of the table, Dominic initiated a series of heavily encrypted phone calls to his deeply entrenched political proxies and high-level federal contacts. He spoke in low, decisive tones, his voice a lethal instrument that brokered absolutely zero compromise. I listened as he perfectly maneuvered the federal oversight committees, using my structural analysis as an undeniable legal battering ram to bypass the standard bureaucratic delays. He was far more than a cartel boss. He was an apex predator who understood that the most devastating weapons in the modern world were often wrapped in bureaucratic red tape. Absolute control. Today, the culmination of our 6-month strategic planning unfolded with brutal mechanical efficiency. We remained in the subterranean war room, the high-definition monitors now displaying a mosaic of live, encrypted surveillance feeds and breaking local news broadcasts. I stood right beside Dominic, his large, incredibly warm hand resting firmly on the small of my back, anchoring me to the triumphant reality of the moment. On the primary screen, a convoy of heavily armored federal vehicles and municipal engineering trucks descended upon Belikov's industrial distribution center. Armed federal agents, acting on the emergency structural condemnation orders triggered by my digital blueprints, aggressively breached the main gates. They didn't encounter syndicate resistance. Belikov's thugs, entirely unprepared for a massive, legally sanctioned federal raid based on public safety violations, immediately surrendered or fled the perimeter. They are accessing the subterranean vaults now, Mateo reported from his tactical station, his voice resonating with a quiet, highly disciplined satisfaction. The federal structural engineers have confirmed the severe load-bearing column degradation, exactly as you calculated, Clara. The building has been officially classified as a critical collapse hazard. The municipal authorities are executing a full, permanent seizure of the property. I watched the aerial drone footage as the massive industrial complex was systematically locked down behind heavy municipal barricades and bright yellow condemnation tape. The hidden operations, the illegal weapons trafficking, the unlicensed chemical storage, all of it was hopelessly trapped inside the structurally compromised vaults, completely out of Belikov's reach and permanently confiscated by the federal government. His primary logistical artery had been brutally severed, his supply lines entirely decimated, and his financial infrastructure utterly paralyzed. Belikov is attempting to flee the eastern seaboard, Mateo added, monitoring a separate, highly classified frequency. Without his primary distribution hub and his hidden assets, his rival backers have immediately withdrawn their support. He is financially bankrupt and completely isolated. His syndicate is fractured beyond repair. Let him run, Dominic commanded softly, his tone laced with a chilling absolute finality. The storm gray of his eyes was dark and turbulent, reflecting the quiet satisfaction of a sovereign who had successfully protected his queen and eradicated a threat. He is a dead man walking, stripped of his territory and his teeth. He will never step foot within 1,000 miles of this city again. The threat is neutralized, permanently. The sheer magnitude of the victory washed over me, a profound, heavy wave of absolute relief that finally, irrevocably extinguished the last, lingering embers of my past trauma. I had not been forced to fire a gun. I had not been forced to compromise my morality or descend into the brutal violence that defined the underworld. I had destroyed the monster, who hunted me using the very intellect and professional competence that the corporate world had consistently overlooked. But the underworld abhors a vacuum. With Belikov's territory suddenly fractured and his primary logistics permanently paralyzed, a massive territorial gap opened along the eastern docks. Dominic's empire was already moving to seize it, strategically expanding our reach to absorb the newly available maritime routes. The victory was absolute, but in the Rossini syndicate, survival meant immediately securing the newly conquered ground. We were expanding, but the machinery of the Rossini syndicate never slept, and my role as lead estate architect demanded constant vigilance. Before the monitors could even fully switch off from the drone footage of Belikov's confiscated complex, Matteo Moretti cleared his throat. His highly disciplined posture shifted as he pulled up a new set of digital schematics on the secondary screen. "We have an immediate secondary issue," Matteo stated quietly, his eyes flicking from the screen to Dominic. "We just finalized the acquisition of the commercial waterfront terminal on the southern docks, stepping directly into the territorial vacuum left by Belikov's collapse. Seizing his old supply lines is a critical tactical expansion for the syndicate's inbound maritime logistics. However, my advanced security team has identified a massive vulnerability at the western loading dock. Because of historical zoning laws in that specific sector, we cannot erect a traditional reinforced perimeter wall without drawing immediate municipal scrutiny. The approach is wide open. It is entirely exposed to a vehicle-based assault. I didn't even blink. The architectural parameters of the city were already permanently mapped in my mind. The intellectual battlefield was where I thrived, the drafting screen my equivalent of a loaded weapon. I stepped back to the head of the conference table, my fingers flying across the tempered glass of my tablet, as I rapidly pulled up the geological surveys for the waterfront sector. My mind raced, calculating stress loads and subterranean densities with the same hyper-focused adrenaline that had kept me alive in the hotel crawl spaces. A visible wall is a liability, I countered smoothly, my voice echoing with pure professional authority. It signals to our enemies exactly where the perimeter begins, giving them the exact coordinates to plan a breach. We don't need to build up, we need to build down. I swiped the stylus across the screen, replacing Matteo's standard security overlay with my own proprietary 3D digital blueprints. The water table near the commercial waterfront terminal is unusually low due to the historical landfill layers, I explained, zooming in on the exposed western loading dock. We can bypass the municipal aesthetic zoning restrictions completely. I propose the immediate excavation and installation of a hidden subterranean security defense system. We sink military-grade concrete columns directly into the bedrock, and we top them with a network of hydraulic steel bollards. Matteo's sharp eyes widened fractionally as he traced the vectors of my design. They would be completely invisible from the street, he murmured, the tactical brilliance of the solution immediately registering. Exactly, I confirmed, my tone decisive. They remain flush with the pavement, allowing our commercial transport trucks unimpeded access. But in the event of an unauthorized perimeter breach, Matteo's control room can trigger the hydraulics. The hydraulic steel bollards will deploy in 0.6 seconds. They are rated to stop a fully loaded, 7-ton armored vehicle traveling at 60 miles per hour dead in its tracks. The historical zoning board will never see them, and any remaining rival factions won't know they exist until it's physically tearing their chassis apart. Dominic leaned back in his leather chair, the intense gray of his eyes darkening with a profound, unyielding pride that made my pulse completely erratic. He didn't ask his legal team for a secondary opinion. He didn't hesitate. This was the absolute trust of a sovereign who recognized his equal. Matteo, Dominic commanded, his voice a low, gravelly vibration of absolute authority. Begin the emergency installation of Clara's design at midnight. I want the subterranean excavation crews mobilized immediately, and double the perimeter security patrols around the commercial waterfront terminal until the hydraulic steel bollards are fully operational. Understood, boss, Matteo replied, offering me a crisp, highly respectful nod before gathering his encrypted tablets. Slowly, the elite legal team and the tactical operators began to gather their encrypted files and quietly exit the subterranean bunker. They offered me deep, respectful nods as they passed, their previous corporate skepticism entirely replaced by an unshakable reverence for the architect who had engineered their bloodless victory and secured their newest fortress. Matteo was the last to leave, offering a crisp bow before the heavy soundproofed doors clicked shut behind him, sealing the acoustic perfection of the boardroom. Suddenly, we were completely alone. The massive, high-definition monitors faded to a soft, ambient standby glow, casting long, intimate shadows across the polished timber paneling and the expansive conference table. Dominic turned to fully face me, the rigid, tactical posture he had maintained throughout the briefing instantly melting away. He closed the microscopic distance between us, his large hands reaching out to gently cup my face. The electric grounding heat of his palms sent a massive, highly charged jolt straight through my nervous system, instantly erasing the cold, analytical mindset of the architectural audit. He looked down at me, his gaze sweeping over my features with a slow, intense devotion that made my breath hitch audibly in the quiet room. "It is finished, Clara?" Dominic murmured, his thumbs brushing softly against my cheekbones. The scent of bergamot and aged whiskey enveloped me entirely, completely overriding the sterile smell of the war room. The men who shattered the historic wooden entries of the notorious hotel. The men who forced you to run barefoot through the freezing darkness. They are nothing but ash and forgotten history. You built the mechanism of their destruction flawlessly. I just calculated the undeniable structural realities, I whispered, my voice trembling slightly as the profound emotional weight of my absolute safety finally settled deep within my bones. I leaned into his searing touch, my hands coming up to rest flat against the crisp fabric of his tailored shirt, feeling the steady, powerful thud of his heart beneath my palms. I knew exactly where the foundation was weak. You knew exactly how to make the world yield to your intellect. Dominic corrected gently, lowering his head until his forehead rested intimately against mine. The slow burn tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of our professional tactical partnership violently reignited, a heavy, intoxicating dynamic that demanded total surrender. You are the most brilliant, dangerous woman I have ever known, and you are entirely mine to protect. He didn't wait for my response. Dominic leaned down, his mouth covering mine in a slow, devastatingly possessive kiss that tasted of absolute victory and unyielding devotion. It wasn't a rushed, aggressive collision of physical dominance. It was a deep, reverent acknowledgement of our equal partnership. I melted completely against his solid frame, my fingers tangling in the soft, dark hair at the nape of his neck. The freezing, exhausted draftsman who had mapped blind spots to survive was a memory. I was Clara Vance, the sovereign architect of the Rossini Empire, entirely safe, profoundly loved, and permanently anchored in the arms of the man who had locked the danger out forever. The biting, relentless winds that routinely swept off the Boston harbor had been meticulously neutralized by the time they reached the sprawling outdoor terrace of the Beacon Hill penthouse. I sat entirely alone in the quiet expanse of the elevated sanctuary, surrounded by the subtle, radiant heat of the concealed infrared architectural lamps, seamlessly integrated into the overhead structural canopy. It was late, the city below me reduced to a sprawling, glittering grid of amber and white lights bleeding into the dark, churning waters of the Charles River. The silence on the terrace was not empty. It was rich, impenetrable, and tasted of chilled night air, rain-washed steel, and absolute, undisputed security. I rested my elbows against the smooth, unyielding surface of a custom-fabricated drafting table that had been brought out specifically for my evening work. My fingers moved with crisp, practiced efficiency over the tempered glass screen of my upgraded tablet, manipulating a massive, three-dimensional digital model that hovered in the stark clinical glow of the display. I was no longer an invisible, financially drowning corporate drone, desperately trying to calculate the structural integrity of a crumbling historic hotel to pay off predatory hospice bills. The woman who had shivered in her bare feet while being hunted through dusty ceiling, crawl spaces, felt like a distant, fragmented memory belonging to someone else entirely. Those initial days of physical and emotional recovery at the penthouse, when I would still jump at the sound of a closing door, had gradually faded, replaced over these 6 months by an unshakable peace. Tonight, I was finalizing the headquarters architectural schematics for the Rossisi Syndic's new 70-story tower. It was a staggering, monumental undertaking located in the epicenter of the financial district, and Dominic had entrusted the absolute entirety of its structural design to my intellect. I zoomed in aggressively on the upper executive echelons, my stylus highlighting the complex network of load-bearing titanium columns I had engineered to replace the standard commercial steel framework. The building was designed to project breathtaking, modern elegance to the corporate world, featuring sweeping curves of reinforced glass and imported limestone. But beneath that polished, aristocratic veneer, I was meticulously building a fortified military-grade bunker. I pulled up the specific stress test algorithms for the sovereign suite occupying the top 3 floors. I didn't just calculate basic wind shear and standard gravitational loads. I was factoring in the kinetic dissipation requirements for sustained ballistic impacts and targeted explosive concussions. I routed the primary executive elevator shafts through the absolute center of the building's concrete core, surrounding them with overlapping layers of high-density ballistic resin and acoustic dampening foam. I had spent 28 years perfecting the craft of absolute concealment, learning how to find the hidden structural voids where a terrified girl could hide from a cruel, unforgiving world. Now, I was using that exact same hyper-focused spatial awareness to ensure that the people within this new tower would never have to hide at all. I was designing an empire without a single blind spot, a quiet, familiar friction of leather against the pristine outdoor granite floor drew my attention away from the glowing blue wireframes. I didn't flinch, and my pulse didn't spike with the sudden, acidic rush of adrenaline that used to dictate my every waking moment. My nervous system had fundamentally rewired itself over the past half year, learning to recognize the sound of his approach not as a threat, but as the ultimate biological signal for rest. Dominic stepped out onto the terrace, moving with that terrifying, silent grace that defied his massive, broad-shouldered frame. The ambient, golden light of the heating lamps caught the sharp, aristocratic angles of his jaw and the dark storm gray of his eyes. He had removed his formal suit jacket and tie after our return from the subterranean tactical boardroom, leaving the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt casually undone. Despite the relaxed state of his clothing, the lethal sovereign energy he projected remained entirely undiminished. He was an apex predator at rest within his own undisputed territory. He didn't speak immediately. He walked up behind my high-backed chair, carrying a heavy, incredibly soft cashmere throw. With a deliberate, mesmerizing slowness, he draped the expensive fabric over my shoulders, effectively sealing out the minor chill of the autumn night. The rich, intoxicating scent of bergamot, aged whiskey, and raw power washed over me, instantly anchoring my mind to the present moment. His large, incredibly warm hands came to rest flat against my collarbones, his thumbs brushing lightly against the sensitive skin of my neck. The electric, grounding heat of his touch sent a profound, quiet shiver straight down my spine, relaxing muscles I hadn't even realized I was keeping tense. "You have been staring at the digital blueprints of the headquarters for 4 uninterrupted hours, Clara," Dominic murmured, his low, gravelly voice vibrating pleasantly against the cool night air. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze tracking the complex, color-coded vectors and titanium reinforcement schematics displayed on my screen. "The structural integrity of the tower is already mathematically flawless. You have engineered a fortress that defies the very laws of conventional commercial architecture. You do not need to overwork the foundation." "I am not checking the foundation," I replied softly, my hands coming up to rest over his large fingers, absorbing the steady, unyielding strength he so freely offered. I rotated the 3D model on the screen, exposing the intricate, highly classified ghost routes and secondary emergency egress tunnels I had woven into the sub-basements. "I am reviewing the subterranean egress pathways. In the corporate world, architects design exits to meet minimum municipal fire codes. But I know exactly what happens when those standard exits are compromised. I remember what it feels like to be trapped in a hallway with the primary stairwells welded shut and the elevator shafts rigged with incendiary charges. I am making absolutely certain that if the world ever burns outside these glass walls, our people will always have a safe, undeniable way out." Dominic's hands tightened fractionally on my shoulders, a subtle, highly possessive flex of his muscles that communicated a depth of understanding words could never adequately capture. He knew the trauma that still occasionally ghosted through the back of my mind. He knew I was methodically working out my past nightmares through the medium of load-bearing concrete and titanium rebar. "Viktor Belikov is a ghost, Clara. His empire is ash, and his men are scattered to the winds. The threat that cornered you in the Grand Plaza no longer exists on this earth," Dominic stated, his tone carrying the absolute, chilling finality of a sovereign who had personally ensured the destruction of my monsters. He stepped around the side of the drafting table, completely blocking the panoramic view of the city with his towering presence. "You do not have to design from a place of fear anymore." "I am not designing out of fear," I corrected quietly, looking up to meet his intense, penetrating stare. "I let go of the tablet entirely, severing my connection to the work. I am designing out of preservation. There is a massive difference. Fear makes you blind. It makes you rush your calculations and accept inferior materials because you are desperate just to survive the night. Preservation is calculated. It is the cold, deliberate act of building a sanctuary so strong that fear is simply never allowed to enter the premises. You taught me that distinction." A profound, incredibly heavy look of respect visibly softened the harsh, lethal lines of his face. He reached out, his long fingers gently tapping the power button on the edge of my tablet. The clinical, harsh blue light of the digital schematics instantly vanished, plunging our immediate space back into the soft, intimate, amber glow of the terrace lamps. He was actively removing the architectural barrier between us, demanding my complete, undivided attention in the physical world. "Stand up, Clara," he commanded softly, the request carrying the gentle, irresistible gravity of a tide pulling at the shoreline. I pushed my chair back and rose to my feet, the heavy cashmere throw slipping slightly off one shoulder before I caught it. Standing directly in front of him, the massive class disparity that had once made me feel so incredibly small and insignificant, was entirely absent. I didn't see the untouchable billionaire or the ruthless cartel boss. I saw the man who had physically shielded me from an armed death squad. The man who had meticulously cleaned a dirty, bleeding scrape on my wrist while treating my intellect like the most valuable asset he had ever encountered. Dominic reached for my left hand. His grip was firm, encasing my slender, faded drafting scars within his large, calloused palm. He slowly led me away from the drafting table, guiding me toward the very edge of the terrace where the thick, bulletproof glass parapet met the night sky. We stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out over the sprawling, glowing grid of Boston. The city looked deceptively peaceful from this elevated vantage point, a sweeping tapestry of light and shadow, completely ignorant of the brutal, high-stakes wars fought within its hidden arteries. When you accidentally breached the heavy mahogany door of room 404 6 months ago, you brought chaos into my absolute silence. Dominic began, his voice a low, deeply resonant rumble that seemed to harmonize with the distant hum of the urban landscape. His gaze avoided the city. His unwavering eyes remained entirely, possessively fixed on my profile. I had spent my entire life fortifying my empire, surrounding myself with highly trained tacticians and lethal operators. But I had never met anyone who could look at the impenetrable walls of a killing floor and instantly calculate the mathematics of survival. You did not ask me to save you, Clara. You offered me the blueprints to save us both. I turned my head to look at him, my heart performing a sudden, rapid flutter against my ribs. The slow burn tension that was the constant, defining hallmark of our relationship suddenly spiked, thickening the cool night air until it felt incredibly heavy to breathe. I was terrified, I admitted, my voice dropping to a raw, honest whisper. The memories of the spilled wine in that VIP room flashed through my mind. How I had stared at the crimson liquid creeping across the white tablecloth, like blood seeping through gauze, convinced my own life was about to violently bleed out onto the floorboards. As I was a drowning woman who had just run out of air, you were the only solid thing in the dark, and you are the only solid thing in mine, Dominic countered instantly, his tone fierce and completely devoid of his usual guarded stoicism. He shifted his stance, turning his body fully toward me. With his free hand, he reached into the inner pocket of his crisp white shirt. He didn't drop to one knee in a display of conventional, submissive romance. The man who owned the night did not yield to tradition. He forged his own sovereign contracts. He withdrew a small, meticulously crafted box constructed from dark, brushed titanium, a material specifically chosen to mirror the indestructible foundations I engineered for his properties. My breath hitched audibly, my lungs freezing mid-expansion. Dominic flipped the titanium lid open with a smooth, decisive click. Resting on a bed of dark velvet was not a fragile, delicate diamond, but a massive, breathtakingly deep, green emerald engagement ring. The gemstone was custom cut, featuring sharp, commanding geometric facets that caught the ambient gold light of the terrace and refracted it with cold, brilliant fire. It was set in a heavy, brutalist band of solid platinum, a design that completely eschewed fragile aesthetics in favor of raw, undeniable structural permanence. It was a ring designed for a queen who built fortresses, not a princess waiting in a tower. The corporate world looked at your brilliant mind and saw an invisible, disposable draftsman. Dominic stated, his voice vibrating with a dark, territorial intensity as he removed the heavy ring from the box. I looked at you and saw the architect of my future. You have spent the last 6 months systematically tearing down the vulnerabilities of this syndicate, designing impenetrable walls to keep our enemies out. Now, let me permanently secure your place within them. He lifted my left hand, his turbulent gaze locking onto mine, with an intensity that burned straight through to my soul. I am not asking you to merely wear my name, Clara, Dominic vowed, the sheer, staggering weight of his words acting as the ultimate, unbreakable contract between us. I am asking you to share the absolute sovereignty of this empire, build your blueprints, engineer your safe havens, but do it as my equal, my partner, and my wife. I will be the shield that stands before you, and you will be the mind that guides us. Give me the right to ensure that the ultimate protective boundary of our lives remains permanently locked against the danger, forever. Tears, hot and completely unbidden, finally broke free and spilled over my eyelashes, tracking silently down my cold cheeks. They were not tears of exhaustion, or panic, or the crushing weight of medical debt. They were the pure, crystallized manifestation of absolute relief, The endless, grueling war for basic survival was truly definitively over. Yes, I whispered, the single syllable carrying the entire weight of my fiercely guarded heart. Yes, Dominic. He didn't hesitate. Dominic slid the emerald engagement ring onto my finger. The cold platinum band settled heavily against my skin, sitting right next to the tiny faded scar from a drafting compass I had acquired years ago. The physical weight of the jewelry was incredibly grounding, a constant, tactile reminder of the massive power and absolute safety that now belonged to me. The gemstone glowed with a deep, fierce light, completely replacing the lingering, haunting memory of the spilled red wine. As the ring slid perfectly into place, Dominic's hands moved instantly to my waist, hauling me flush against the hard, unyielding wall of his chest. He lowered his head, capturing my mouth in a kiss that tasted of rain, aged whiskey, and absolute undisputed victory. It was a searing, possessive claim that shattered the final, lingering shadows of my past. I wrapped my arms around his neck, my fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of his neck, kissing him back with all the fierce, resilient strength of survivor who had finally stopped running. The wind howled distantly over the glowing Boston skyline, the chaotic, dangerous world continuing its endless churn of violence and betrayal far below us. But standing on the elevated terrace, anchored in the arms of the city's most lethal sovereign, the outside world simply ceased to matter. The architectural anomaly had become the master design. The terrified girl who had hidden in the wrong VIP room was gone, and the sovereign architect of the Rossini Empire remained. The danger was permanently locked outside, and for the first time in my entire life, I was finally, truly home.